For 14 years, I cooked, raised our children, and quietly funded his ambitions. You are useless outside this kitchen, my husband sneered to his colleagues. The next morning, his billionaire CEO placed a multi-million-dollar contract before me and revealed to the entire room whose brilliant talent had truly built their company. The sharp clink of a silver fork against fine china cut through the low hum of conversation. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, our 14th wedding anniversary. I stood quietly near the arched doorway of our formal dining room, a heavy silver serving tray resting against my hip. I am 35 years old. To the colleagues and family members seated around my impeccably set table, I am simply Emily, the quiet, devoted stay-at-home mother, the woman who bakes organic sourdough from scratch and keeps the sprawling suburban house spotless. They see a woman who willingly gave up her 20s to support her rising star of a husband. What they do not see, what my husband Richard actively hides from them, is that I was once a razor-sharp financial analyst. I traded my corner office for this kitchen because I loved the man I married. I believed in his dreams so completely that I liquidated my personal trust fund to provide the seed money for his first major project. For 3 years, I spent my nights drafting his business plans, balancing his ledgers, and perfecting the organic preservative formulas that he was now using to secure a massive promotion to Executive Vice President of Marketing. I built the engine of his success in the shadows while he stood in the spotlight. I watched Richard holding court at the head of the long oak table. He wore a tailored navy suit paid for entirely by my inheritance. He swirled a glass of expensive Cabernet, laughing loudly at a joke his brother Tom had just told. The dining room was filled with Richard's corporate colleagues, men and women in expensive clothes who looked at me with polite pity every time I stepped out to refill their water glasses or clear their plates. I had spent 48 hours preparing this elaborate 5-course meal. Roasted duck with a cherry reduction perfectly seared scallops and a complex organic glaze that I developed myself. Every detail was completely flawless. I pushed myself to the brink of exhaustion because tomorrow, Richard was pitching our project to the CEO of his food conglomerate. This dinner was meant to project an image of absolute stability, financial success, and domestic perfection. Tom leaned back in his heavy wooden chair, patting his stomach with a satisfied groan. Richard, you are on the verge of landing a $5 million deal tomorrow. You are about to enter the big leagues. Tell me, how does Emily keep up with a heavy hitter like you? The table went dead quiet. A few colleagues chuckled nervously, exchanging uncomfortable glances. I froze in the hallway, my grip tightening on the handles of the silver tray until my fingers ached. I waited for my husband to defend me. I waited for him to mention my endless nights of research, my complex financial models, or at least my unwavering dedication to our family. Instead, Richard smirked. His eyes flicked toward me, completely devoid of warmth or respect. Emily, please, she is completely useless at anything outside this kitchen. If it were not for me, she would not even know how to balance a checkbook. The entire table erupted in roaring laughter. The sound of their laughter hit me like a physical blow. My lungs felt uncomfortably tight, stripped of all oxygen. The man I had sacrificed my entire youth for, the man whose multi-million-dollar pitch was entirely written by my hand, was reducing me to a cheap punchline for his own amusement. I looked at Tom, who was wiping a tear of mirth from his eye, and then I looked directly at Richard. Richard raised his wineglass to me, a smug, arrogant smile plastered across his handsome face. He actually expected me to laugh along with them. He expected me to swallow the bitter humiliation like a good, obedient, invisible wife. I felt a hot flush of anger rise deep in my chest, a primal, violent fury that urged me to step forward and scream the truth to everyone in the room. But I forced the anger down. A seasoned financial analyst knows never to reveal her cards when the opponent holds the table. I swallowed the thick, painful lump in my throat. I plastered a serene, polite smile onto my face. I bowed my head slightly to the guests and retreated into the kitchen without uttering a single word. In the sterile quiet of the kitchen, the swinging door closed firmly, cutting off the sounds of their cruel laughter. I leaned heavily against the cool marble countertop, pressing my palms flat against the stone until my knuckles turned stark white. 14 years. I was 21 when I married him. We had absolutely nothing. I worked 60-hour weeks at a grueling accounting firm to pay our rent while he bounced between failed marketing startups and empty promises. I bought his first interview suit on my personal credit card. I packed his lunches every day. I rubbed his shoulders when he cried over rejections. And when he finally landed a junior position at the food corporation, I was the one who managed his schedules and polished his presentations. When my parents passed away and left me a substantial trust fund, I did not hesitate to invest it into our joint savings. Our money, he called it. Our future. I had poured every ounce of my intellect and capital into building Richard into the successful man who sat in that dining room. And he had just declared me utterly useless. The sheer audacity of his betrayal tasted like ash in my mouth. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing my racing heart rate to slow. I refused to cry. Tears were a luxury I could not afford tonight. I had dishes to clear. I had a submissive role to play. I began to stack the delicate dessert plates, my hands trembling slightly despite my best efforts to remain calm and collected. The rage was a living thing inside my chest, vibrating against my ribs with every breath I took. I needed to focus on a simple task. I needed to clean the kitchen and pretend everything was perfectly normal. I walked back into the dim hallway to gather the empty wine glasses resting on the antique side console. Richard had carelessly tossed his leather briefcase and his company iPad onto the narrow table when he arrived home. As I reached past the heavy briefcase to grab a crystal goblet, my shaking fingers misjudged the distance. The heavy goblet tipped over, knocking directly into the edge of the iPad. The silver device slid off the polished wood and crashed onto the hardwood floor with a loud, sharp clatter. I dropped to my knees, panic briefly overriding my simmering anger. If the screen was cracked, Richard would use it as another excuse to berate and humiliate me in front of his family. I flipped the device over with shaking hands. The glass screen was perfectly intact, but the physical impact had woken the iPad from its dark sleep mode. The bright light illuminated my pale face in the shadows of the hallway. Right there on the locked screen was a new text message notification. It was from Ashley. Ashley was his 24-year-old executive assistant. She had joined the marketing department 6 months ago. She was always overly sweet to me, always complimenting my cooking with a sugary smile that never quite reached her cold eyes. I stared at the words glowing brightly on the digital screen. The text read, "Tomorrow after you finalize the contract with the CEO, shall we kick that country bumpkin wife out of the house?" My heart stopped beating in my chest. The hallway plunged into a deafening, terrifying silence. I did not cry. I did not scream out in agony. A terrible, freezing clarity washed over my entire body. Country bumpkin wife. Kick her out of the house. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the iPad to my chest as if it were a ticking bomb ready to detonate. I cast a frantic glance toward the brightly lit dining room. The guests were still laughing and drinking, completely oblivious to the destruction of my marriage happening just feet away. I rushed back into the kitchen and locked the heavy wooden door securely behind me. I retreated into the dark walk-in pantry, hiding myself among the tall shelves of organic spices and canned goods. I sat on the cold tile floor, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I needed to see more. I needed to know the full, horrifying extent of the nightmare I had just uncovered. His iPad was securely locked with a passcode. Richard changed his corporate passwords constantly, always claiming his marketing strategies were highly confidential and valuable. But he was fundamentally an arrogant, predictable man. Arrogant men always underestimate the women they consider weak and useless. I remembered the security code he used for his home office alarm system. I typed in the 4 digits of our wedding month and day. The screen shook side to side, rejecting the code. I closed my eyes, forcing my brain to think like a cold, detached analyst. I typed the year we bought our suburban house. Rejected again. I typed Ashley's birth year, a minor detail he had casually mentioned during dinner weeks ago. The screen unlocked instantly. A fresh wave of sickening nausea rolled over me, but I ruthlessly pushed it down. I opened his primary messaging application. There were hundreds of messages between him and Ashley. Dozens of photos of them drinking expensive champagne in luxury hotel rooms. Long text chains mocking my clothes, my cooking, and my blind devotion to our marriage. But the personal betrayal As agonizing and heartbreaking as it was, paled in comparison to the calculated financial execution he was actively planning. I opened his synced corporate cloud drive. I found the final presentation slides for tomorrow's pitch to the CEO. The project was named Heritage Kitchen. It was a $5 million proposal for a new line of organic shelf-stable health foods. It was my project. I had spent 3 grueling years researching the supply chain, analyzing the complex profit margins, and chemically balancing the natural preservatives. I scrolled frantically through the executive summary. Richard had systematically deleted my name from every single legal document. He had completely rewritten the founder's statement to claim he had developed the recipes alone in his spare time. He was blatantly stealing my intellectual property to secure a massive executive payout and a permanent promotion. My trembling fingers flew across the glass screen opening his synced banking applications. My chest tightened painfully as the financial dashboard loaded. We had a joint savings account that held the entire remainder of my parents' inheritance, a vital safety net of over $200,000. The balance currently read $412. I gasped out loud, pressing my hand tightly over my mouth to stifle a hysterical cry. I frantically pulled up the recent transaction history. Last week, Richard had initiated a massive, irrevocable wire transfer. I cross-referenced the transfer date with his personal emails. He had used my parents' money to put a massive cash down payment on a luxury high-rise condo in downtown Chicago. I opened the digital property deed attached to his inbox. The real estate was registered solely under the name Ashley. The sheer cruelty of his actions was absolute. He had deliberately drained my family's legacy to build a lavish love nest for his young mistress. I read their latest text messages, again my vision tunneling. His master plan was brutally, disgustingly clear. Tomorrow, at exactly noon, the CEO of the conglomerate, Harrison Pierce, was coming to our home for a private lunch and the final approval of the Heritage Kitchen contract. Richard needed my gourmet cooking and my spotless house to play the perfect, reliable family man one last time. Once the $5 million deal was signed and secured, he planned to serve me with divorce papers, claiming I had contributed absolutely nothing to the marriage or his career. He intended to throw me out on the street with absolutely nothing to my name, leaving me destitute and broken while he lived in a penthouse funded by my dead parents. I sat alone on the pantry floor, surrounded by the undeniable physical evidence of my 14 years of blind, foolish loyalty. The utter devastation threatened to tear my mind apart. But as I stared at the glowing screen illuminating the dark pantry, the hot tears dried completely in my eyes. The heartbroken, useless housewife died on that cold tile floor. In her place, a seasoned, ruthless financial auditor stood up. Richard thought I was a naive cook who would quietly disappear into the night. He was about to learn that the person who controls the numbers controls the entire game. I unlocked the pantry door and stepped boldly back into the bright kitchen, fully prepared to go to war. The heavy oak door of the master bedroom clicked shut behind me with a soft metallic finality. I stood in the dark hallway, my bare feet pressed against the freezing hardwood floor. The silence of the house was absolute, broken only by the low, rhythmic snoring radiating from the bed I had just abandoned. Richard was sleeping the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who believed he had outsmarted the entire world. A man who thought his 14-year charade was completely secure. I clutched his silver tablet to my chest, the cold aluminum pressing through my thin cotton nightgown. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my hands were surprisingly steady. I did not turn on the hallway lights. I navigated the familiar path to the downstairs guest bathroom strictly by memory. Once inside the cramped, windowless space, I turned the brass lock. I flipped the light switch, wincing as the harsh fluorescent bulbs illuminated the stark white tiles. I sank onto the closed toilet lid and placed the tablet on my lap. The screen was black, a dark mirror reflecting a woman I barely recognized. My face was pale drawn and stripped of the pleasant, subservient smile I had worn all evening during our anniversary dinner. The devoted housewife had vanished somewhere between the dining room and this sterile bathroom. In her place sat a woman waking up from a very long, very dangerous coma. I pressed the home button. The screen flared to life, demanding a passcode. Richard was an arrogant man, but he was also fundamentally lazy. He prided himself on his complex marketing strategies, but his personal security was always an afterthought. I typed in the 4-digit code corresponding to our wedding anniversary. The device unlocked instantly, a bitter testament to the marriage he was actively destroying. The home screen was cluttered with corporate applications and unread email notifications. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the rising tide of panic down into the pit of my stomach. I was no longer a betrayed wife looking for evidence of a cheap affair. I was a senior financial auditor stepping into a crime scene. I opened his primary cloud storage drive, searching for the presentation he was supposed to deliver to the CEO in mere hours. It did not take long to find. A bright yellow folder sat at the very top of his recent files, boldly labeled Heritage Kitchen Master Pitch. I tapped the icon. A massive, perfectly formatted presentation deck loaded onto the screen. My eyes scanned the title slide, and the air abruptly vanished from my lungs. There, in bold, elegant typography, was the name of the project, Heritage Kitchen, a revolutionary line of organic shelf-stable health foods projected to generate $5 million in its first fiscal year. Right below the title was a single name listed as the sole founder and visionary creator, Richard. The sheer audacity of it struck me with physical force. Heritage Kitchen was not his idea. It had never been his idea. For the past 3 years, I had poured every ounce of my intellect and business acumen into this exact project. While Richard spent his evenings drinking expensive scotch with his colleagues, I sat at the kitchen island until 3 a.m, cross-referencing organic supply chain logistics. I was the one who mathematically optimized the profit margins. I was the one who spent countless weeks researching and chemically balancing the natural preservatives to ensure a 2-year shelf life without compromising the organic certification. It was my brainchild born from my sweat, my late-night calculations, and my relentless dedication to building our family empire. I scrolled frantically through the executive summary, my breathing shallow and fast. He had taken my master business plan and systematically stripped my identity from every single page. He had deleted my complex financial models and replaced the authorship metadata with his own corporate credentials. I opened the founder's statement. My eyes burned as I read the paragraphs he had fabricated. He wrote eloquently about his personal passion for healthy living, claiming he had developed these proprietary recipes alone in his spare time. He spun a compelling inspirational narrative for the CEO, presenting himself as a solo genius who had single-handedly cracked the code on sustainable organic preservation. He was preparing to walk into a meeting with Harrison Pierce and sell my intellectual property to secure a multi-million-dollar executive contract for himself. A profound, suffocating anger began to spread through my veins. It was a cold, calculating rage. This was not just a betrayal of our wedding vows. This was corporate theft. He was legally hijacking my mind, my work, and my future. I closed the presentation deck and opened his sent emails, searching for the legal framework of his deception. I found a thread with a corporate patent attorney. Richard had expedited the trademark registrations for Heritage Kitchen entirely under his own name, explicitly instructing the lawyer to ensure his wife had no legal claim to the intellectual property. He was building a fortress around my stolen work, preparing to lock me out of my own creation. But the intellectual theft, as devastating as it was only the first layer of his treachery. The seasoned analyst inside me knew that men who steal ideas usually steal money. My trembling fingers exited the cloud drive and hovered over the icon for his synced banking application. I hesitated for a fraction of a second. This was the precipice. Once I opened this app, there was no going back to the illusion of my suburban life. I tapped the icon. The financial dashboard loaded, displaying our checking and joint savings accounts. My gaze locked onto the balance of the joint savings, and a visceral shockwave slammed into my gut. The account, which had safely held my entire inheritance from my late parents' trust fund, was supposed to reflect a balance of over $200,000. It was our ultimate safety net, the money I had guarded fiercely for 14 years. The current available balance read $412. I gasped, pressing my hands over my mouth to muffle the sound. I stared at the numbers, willing them to change, praying it was a banking error. But the digits remained stubbornly, cruelly low. Over $200,000 of my parents' legacy, the money they had worked their entire lives to leave me, was simply gone. I immediately tapped into the transaction history, my eyes scanning the ledger with frantic precision. 2 weeks ago, a massive outgoing wire transfer had decimated the account. The transaction description was vague, listed only as a real estate escrow deposit. I exited the banking app and dove back into his email inbox, typing the word escrow into the search bar. A dozen emails populated the screen. I opened a correspondence chain from a high-end real estate brokerage in downtown Chicago. Attached to the latest email was a finalized purchase agreement. I opened the PDF document and zoomed in on the signatures. Richard had authorized a massive cash down payment on a luxury penthouse apartment overlooking the city skyline, but his name was not on the deed. The property was registered entirely under the name Ashley. The room started to spin. The harsh bathroom light felt blinding. He had not just drained our joint account. He had deliberately, systematically stolen the money my dead parents had left me to buy a luxury love nest for his 24-year-old assistant. He was using my family's blood and sweat to fund a lavish lifestyle for a woman who despised me. I stared at the glossy photos attached to the real estate listing: floor-to-ceiling windows, custom marble countertops, a private rooftop terrace. All of it purchased with the exact funds my father had set aside to ensure my security. I scrolled further down the email chain, seeking the absolute bottom of this nightmare. I found a forwarded message thread between Richard and a prominent divorce attorney. The subject line read, "Asset Separation Strategy." I forced my eyes to read the clinical, emotionless words my husband had typed. The email outlined a brutal, perfectly timed execution. Richard explicitly stated his plan to finalize the $5 million Heritage Kitchen contract with his CEO tomorrow morning. Once the bonus hit his personal offshore account, he intended to serve me with divorce papers immediately. His instructions to the lawyer were sickeningly clear. He wanted to ensure I was left entirely destitute. He planned a divorce immediately after receiving the contract bonus to leave Emily penniless. He wrote that I had not held a formal job in 14 years, that I had no recent income, and that the joint accounts were already legally emptied. He was positioning himself to take the house, the executive promotion, the millions in contract bonuses, and the luxury apartment, leaving me with absolutely nothing. He was going to throw the mother of his children out onto the street without a single dollar to my name. $1.X. I sat perfectly still on the bathroom floor. The tablet screen dimmed, plunging the small room into shadows. The sheer magnitude of his cruelty was almost too vast to comprehend. He had stolen my past, hijacked my present, and was actively assassinating my future. For 14 years, I had been the perfect invisible machine powering his rise to the top. I had sacrificed my career, my ambition, and my inheritance on the altar of his potential. And his gratitude was a calculated plot to destroy me. The hot tears that had been threatening to spill suddenly dried up. The sorrow evaporated, burned away by a searing, absolute resolve. Richard thought I was nothing but a gullible domesticated cook. He had completely forgotten the woman he married. He had forgotten that before I ever tied an apron, I was a shark in the financial sector. He thought he could steal my money and my mind and walk away untouched. He was wrong. As I sat in the cold, silent bathroom, I did not cry for the death of my marriage. I began to plan the financial and professional execution of my soon-to-be ex-husband. He wanted a war over numbers and contracts. Tomorrow morning he was going to get one. The morning sun pierced through the heavy bedroom curtains, casting long and pale shadows across the hardwood floor. I had not slept a single minute. My body was completely numb, frozen, in the exact same position on the edge of the mattress since I returned from the guest bathroom many hours ago. The digital clock on the nightstand clicked to 6:30. Beside me, Richard shifted under the thick down comforter. He let out a loud groan, stretching his arms wide before rolling onto his back. He opened his eyes and looked at the pristine white ceiling with a truly smug and deeply satisfied expression. There was absolutely no guilt in his posture. There was no hesitation in his steady breathing. He was a man who truly believed he held the entire world in the palm of his hand. He was completely unaware that I had spent the entire night uncovering every single one of his wicked lies. I forced my hands to uncurl from the tight fists I had held for many hours. I took a deep breath, bearing the intense pain and betrayal deep inside my chest. I had to play my part flawlessly. I had to become the naive and obedient wife he expected to see. Richard sat up and swung his legs over the side of the large bed. He did not look at me or ask how I was doing. "Get up right now, Emily," he commanded. His voice was thick with sleep, but already dripping with his usual suffocating arrogance. "We have a massive day ahead of us, and I cannot afford any of your typical sluggishness today." I stood up slowly, wrapping my silk robe tightly around my shivering shoulders to ward off the morning chill. "What is happening today?" I asked quietly, keeping my tone perfectly soft and respectfully subservient. Richard stood and walked directly toward his large walk-in closet. "Harrison Pierce is coming here for lunch at exactly noon today," he announced proudly. "He is the chief executive officer of the entire food corporation. He wants to review the Heritage Kitchen project in a private and intimate home setting before he signs the $5 million contract." I felt a violent wave of sickening nausea wash over my entire body. He was actually bringing the chief executive officer into my own home to steal my intellectual property right under my nose. I forcefully swallowed the bitter bile rising in my throat. I smiled gently at his reflection in the mirror. "That is wonderful news, honey," I said softly. "What would you like me to do to prepare for him?" Richard pulled a pristine white dress shirt from its wooden hanger. "I need you to prepare a flawless 3-course organic lunch," he dictated sharply. "I want the roasted vegetable tart to start, followed by the herb-crusted salmon. It needs to be absolutely perfect, Emily. Harrison is a man of exceptional taste and high standards, and when he arrives at the front door, you will serve the food quietly and then immediately disappear back into the kitchen. I do not want you making small talk or embarrassing me in front of my boss. This is high-level corporate business, and you simply do not understand how these complicated financial things work." I looked quietly at the man I had devotedly loved and supported for 14 long years. He was casually reducing me to a silent servant while actively planning to leave me penniless on the street. He was planning to move his young assistant into a luxury penthouse bought entirely with my deceased parents' money. "Of course, Richard," I replied smoothly. "I will go downstairs now and start prepping the fresh ingredients for the meal. You just focus on your big presentation." I turned around and walked out of the master bedroom, my bare feet silent on the thick carpeted stairs. The exact moment I was safely out of his sight, the obedient and submissive smile vanished completely from my face. A cold and terrifying clarity took over my racing mind. I walked straight into the kitchen and closed the heavy wooden door firmly behind me. The bright morning light gleamed off the polished granite countertops and the expensive stainless steel cooking appliances. This quiet kitchen had been my entire world for over a decade. It was the exact place where I had meticulously perfected the organic preservative formulas he was about to sell to Harrison Pierce. But today, this kitchen was going to become my personal war room. I walked over to the center island and pulled my cell phone from the deep pocket of my silk robe. My hands were shaking terribly, not from any fear, but from the massive surge of adrenaline pumping rapidly through my veins. I unlocked the screen and opened my contact list. I scrolled past the numbers for the neighborhood carpool and the dry cleaning service. I stopped abruptly at a name I had not contacted in 3 long years: Arthur Vance. He was a brilliant corporate litigation attorney and a fiercely loyal friend to my late father. Before I gave up my successful career in finance to marry Richard Arthur, and I had worked closely together on several complex corporate asset separation cases, I knew he was exactly the shark I needed to tear Richard apart. I dialed the familiar number and pressed the phone to my ear, listening to it ring continuously as the shower upstairs was suddenly turned on. Richard was happily dreaming of his impending wealth. The water pipes rumbled through the walls, perfectly covering the sound of my voice. Arthur answered the line on the 3rd ring. "Emily," he said warmly. "Arthur, I need your legal help right now." I whispered urgently into the receiver. "My husband is attempting to steal my intellectual property today." I continued, my voice steadying with sudden resolve. "I need a massive legal bomb to destroy him entirely before he signs that contract." The heavy oak door swung open with a violent suddenness that sucked the air out of my lungs. I was standing by the kitchen island, the phone pressed tightly against my ear. I had just finished giving Arthur the condo address when Richard stepped into the room. He was dressed in his tailored navy suit, the silk tie knotted at his throat. His dark hair was wet from the shower, and the sharp scent of his cologne rolled into the kitchen. His eyes, usually so dismissive, were narrowed into slits of pure suspicion. The muscles in his jaw flexed tightly as he stared at the phone in my hand. Panic flared in my chest, a blinding surge of terror that threatened to freeze my vocal cords. If he realized I was speaking to an attorney, my entire plan would disintegrate. He would cancel the meeting with Harrison Pierce, liquidate the assets, and destroy the digital evidence. I had to think faster than I ever had in my 14 years of playing the docile housewife. The financial analyst inside me shoved the panic down into a dark box. I did not drop the phone. I did not flinch. I forcefully shifted my tone from hushed legal urgency to shrill domestic exasperation. I pitched my voice an octave higher, injecting it with the frantic stress of a woman whose world revolved around a dinner menu. I do not care if the delivery truck broke down, I yelled into the receiver, glaring past Richard. I ordered the organic grass, fed tenderloin to be here by 8 sharp. My husband has the chief executive officer of his entire corporation coming to this house for lunch in 4 hours. If I do not have that exact cut of meat in my kitchen within 20 minutes, I am canceling our account and reporting your butcher shop. I huffed loudly, letting out a dramatic breath of air, and rolled my eyes at Richard in an exaggerated display of typical marital annoyance. On the other end of the line, Arthur Vance proved exactly why he was the most feared litigation lawyer in Chicago. A veteran of corporate warfare, he did not miss a single beat of my improvised performance. Message received loud and clear, Mrs. Pierce. Arthur said, his deep voice completely unruffled. The tenderloin will be handled immediately. I pulled the phone away with a loud groan of frustration and slammed my finger against the end call button. I tossed the device onto the granite counter, letting it clatter noisily next to a pile of chopped carrots. I crossed my arms over my chest and turned to face my husband, forcing my hands to stop their trembling. Can you believe the absolute incompetence of these people? I complained, waving my hand dismissively toward the phone. The manager actually tried to tell me they substituted our tenderloin for a cheap ribeye without asking for my permission. Richard stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the kitchen stretched out thick and heavy, broken only by the rapid pounding of my own heart against my ribs. His dark eyes searched my face relentlessly, looking for a crack in my facade, looking for any sign of deception. I held my breath, keeping my expression locked into a perfect mask of trivial rage. I channeled every ounce of my disgust for him into my fake anger over the butcher. Slowly, miraculously, the hard lines of suspicion around his eyes began to soften. They were rapidly replaced by the familiar, suffocating arrogance that defined his entire personality. His massive ego simply could not process the idea that his quiet, obedient wife was capable of orchestrating a complex legal counterattack right under his nose. To him, I was nothing more than a foolish cook who panicked over grocery deliveries. He let out a loud, condescending scoff, shaking his head slowly as he walked over to the coffee maker. Good Lord, Emily, you get completely hysterical over the stupidest little things, he muttered, pouring himself a cup of dark roast without offering me one. Just fix the problem and stop screaming like a lunatic. I need this house to project an atmosphere of sophisticated executive success today, not the chaotic energy of a fish market. I swallowed the bitter bile rising in my throat and forced a tight, apologetic smile onto my face. I will handle it smoothly, honey, I said, keeping my voice soft and submissive once again. The lunch will be absolutely flawless. I promise you will get exactly what you deserve today. He did not catch the double meaning hidden in my words. He simply took a sip of his coffee and gave me a final warning glare. It had better be flawless, he snapped, marching out of the kitchen. I stood completely frozen in the center of the room, listening to the heavy thud of his leather shoes echoing down the hardwood hallway. I waited until I heard the solid click of his office door shutting firmly. Only then did I let out a long, shuddering breath. My knees suddenly felt weak, and I had to grip the edge of the granite island to keep myself from collapsing onto the floor. I closed my eyes, letting the immense wave of relief wash over my trembling body. He had bought the entire performance. His absolute certainty that I was a useless dependent creature had completely blinded him to the lethal trap closing in around him. He truly believed he was the brilliant mastermind, controlling the entire board, manipulating everyone around him for his own financial gain. He had absolutely no idea that the woman he mocked had just moved her queen into the final striking position. The legal injunction was in motion. The stolen money was safely locked away. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for the chief executive officer to arrive and let my arrogant husband walk blindly into his own spectacular destruction. The glass door of the master shower slid shut with a thud. The rush of water hitting the tile echoed through the bedroom, masking my racing heartbeat. Richard took 20 minutes to shower and shave. 20 minutes was a tight window, but it was all the time I had to set my counterattack in motion. I stood at the threshold of the bathroom, ensuring the steam was rising. "Honey, I am running out to the market," I called out cheerfully. "We need a better wine to pair with the tart for Mr. Pierce. I am going to buy that vintage Bordeaux you love." A muffled grunt of approval echoed from behind the glass. "Do not take too long, Emily," his voice boomed. "And make sure it is the reserve. We cannot look cheap today. I will be fast, I promised." The cheerful wife vanished the second I turned my back. I grabbed my leather tote, ensuring the folder of personal trust documents was secured inside. I slipped on dark sunglasses and walked briskly out the front door, pulling it shut. The morning air hit my face, a contrast to the suffocating lies inside that house. I slid into my sedan, jammed the key into the ignition, and threw the car into drive. I did not head toward the market. I turned the steering wheel hard in the opposite direction, merging onto the expressway, heading straight for the downtown financial district. My knuckles turned stark white as I gripped the steering wheel. The digital clock on the dashboard glared back at me. 8:15 in the morning. The downtown traffic was brutal, a sea of brake lights, but I maneuvered through the lanes with a reckless precision. My mind raced through the legal parameters of joint banking and trust fund inheritance laws. I had the original transfer receipts proving the $200,000 came exclusively from my late parents. Legally, I had every right to freeze those specific funds, but I had to beat Richard to the punch. I pulled into the parking garage across from the central bank branch, ignored the parking meter, and sprinted across the concrete plaza. The heavy brass doors yielded to my push. The interior was an expanse of polished marble and hushed conversations. It was a cathedral of money, and today I was here to reclaim my salvation. I bypassed the teller line and walked directly toward the glass-enclosed offices reserved for high-net-worth clients. I need to see a senior account manager immediately. I told the receptionist, my voice carrying a sharp, uncompromising authority. It is a matter of severe financial fraud on a joint account. The receptionist quickly ushered me into a private office. A seasoned bank manager named David looked up from his dual monitors. He wore a crisp gray suit and carried an air of professionalism. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I dropped my heavy leather tote onto his desk and pulled out my identification, my marriage certificate, and the stack of authenticated trust fund transfer records. "My name is Emily Pierce," I stated, sliding the documents across the mahogany desk. "I share a joint savings account with my husband, Richard Pierce. I am enacting my legal right as a joint account holder to immediately freeze all outgoing transactions and transfer the remaining balance into a secure account in my name only." David adjusted his glasses, sensing the absolute gravity of the situation. He picked up my identification and began typing rapidly on his keyboard. "Let me pull up your joint portfolio right now, Mrs. Pierce," he said, his tone shifting into rapid compliance. "Give me just one moment to verify the routing numbers." I sat rigidly in the leather chair, my eyes glued to the back of his monitors. Every second felt like an eternity. I pictured Richard stepping out of the shower, completely unaware that his financial lifeline was currently sitting in a bank office miles away. David stopped typing. The rhythmic clicking of the keyboard abruptly ceased. The color drained slightly from his face as he stared intently at the screen. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowing in deep concern. "Mrs. Pierce." David began, his voice dropping to a serious register. "I am looking at the joint savings account right now. The remaining balance of your inheritance is still there, but it is currently locked in a pending status." "What do you mean it is pending?" I demanded, leaning forward so sharply my chest hit the desk. "The money was fully cleared yesterday. I saw the available balance on the mobile application last night. It was available last night." David confirmed, pointing at a glaring red text block on his screen. "But your husband logged into the portal early this morning. He initiated a massive international wire transfer for the entire remaining balance. He routed it to an offshore corporate account in the Cayman Islands. The air vanished from the small glass office. The sheer terrifying audacity of his plan slammed into me. Richard was actively draining the very last drop of my family legacy to ensure I could not afford a divorce attorney to fight him. He was burning my entire world to the ground while I slept right next to him. Cancel the transfer. I ordered, my voice trembling with raw panic and boiling rage. You have the trust fund documents right in front of you. That is my money. You have to stop that wire. David looked back down at the digital clock displayed on his screen. Mrs. Pierce international wire transfers require a secondary clearing process. Your husband scheduled the execution for the start of the primary banking hours. The funds are set to be permanently released at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. I looked at the analog clock hanging on the bank wall. It was 8:45. Richard timed his financial execution perfectly, leaving me only 15 minutes to save my entire life. The drive back from the downtown financial district was a blur. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind operating with cold precision. The bank manager had secured my trust fund just in time. Richard was now cut off from the wealth he planned to steal. I pulled my sedan into the winding driveway of our suburban home. The brick house looked like a picture of domestic tranquility, but the illusion was shattered the moment I noticed a bright red sports car parked carelessly near the front walkway. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped into the foyer. The house was supposed to be quiet. Richard was upstairs in his home office, supposedly preparing for his massive pitch to the chief executive officer. Instead, the sharp, rhythmic clicking of designer heels echoed on the hardwood floor. I walked toward the kitchen, the heart of my home, and stopped dead in the doorway. Standing at my granite island was Ashley. She was wearing a tight designer dress that looked incredibly out of place in a suburban kitchen. She had a stack of presentation folders spread across the counter. Ashley looked up as I entered. She did not look embarrassed or apologetic. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unconcealed disgust. Richard asked me to come over early to organize the files, she announced, her voice shrill and grating. She adjusted the folders with exaggerated importance, acting as if she owned the house. You took your sweet time at the market. Try not to make too much noise. Some of us actually have real careers and need to focus. I stood completely still. The sheer audacity of this young woman was almost breathtaking. She stood in my kitchen, openly flaunting her affair with my husband while plotting to leave me destitute. I walked calmly to the counter and set my leather tote bag down. I reached for my heavy cotton apron hanging on the pantry door and tied it securely around my waist to cover my pristine white pantsuit. I did not raise my voice. I did not give her the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. It must be exhausting, I said softly, picking up a knife to begin trimming the vegetables. Playing the brilliant corporate assistant while living in a luxury condo paid for by a stolen inheritance. Ashley froze. The smug, victorious smile slipped from her face for a fraction of a second. She recovered quickly, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. I have no idea what you're talking about, she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. Oh, I think you understand perfectly, I continued, my voice remaining as placid as a still lake. Did Richard happen to mention that using corporate funds and my personal trust to buy real estate is a federal felony? Her face flushed a deep red. She scoffed loudly, her arrogance blinding her to the danger she was in. You cannot prove a single thing. Richard is the genius who makes all the money around here. You are just a washed-up housewife. By tomorrow, this house, that contract, and Richard will be mine. You will be lucky to leave here with the clothes on your back. She took a step closer to me. She was holding a large, half-finished iced coffee. Her painted red lips curled into a vicious sneer. She looked me up and down with obvious disdain. You are pathetic, she whispered venomously. Old housewives nearing the end of their careers have no place in his new life. You are past your expiration date. Skinnet. I smiled gently at her childish provocation. I turned my back to her to wash the vegetables in the stainless steel sink. My calmness infuriated her further. She wanted a screaming match. She wanted me to act like a hysterical wife so she could prove to Richard that I was unstable. When I refused to play her game, she decided to escalate the situation. She pretended to turn awkwardly, but in reality, she deliberately slammed into me. The entire cup of cold, dark liquid drenched my pristine white pantsuit. The sticky coffee soaked right through the heavy cotton apron. Ducks. The strong smell of roasted coffee filled my kitchen. The dark puddle dripped from my clothes onto the hardwood floor. I slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. Oops! Ashley mocked, letting out a high-pitched gasp. What a clumsy mistake. You really should watch where you are standing. Now look at you. You're a complete mess. You had better go upstairs and scrub that stain out before the chief executive officer arrives. Richard would be absolutely mortified to see you looking like such a disaster. The urge to reach across the granite island and wipe that smug smile off her face was a living, breathing fire in my chest. She stood there, bathing in her false sense of superiority, believing she had just delivered a humiliating blow. She had no idea that I had placed a small digital voice recorder behind the ceramic sugar bowl on the counter. Every single word she had just spoken, every admission of her intent to take my home, every venomous insult had been captured perfectly on tape. I calmly untied the soiled apron and tossed it into the sink. I took a clean microfiber cloth from the drawer and wiped the sticky liquid from my hands. I did not cry. I did not yell. I looked at the young, foolish girl standing in my kitchen, and I felt a profound sense of pity for her ignorance. You are right about one thing, Ashley, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. Mistakes have consequences, and some stains are absolutely impossible to wash out. She frowned, clearly unsettled by my lack of outrage. She opened her mouth to deliver another insult, but the heavy sound of footsteps descending the main staircase cut her off. Richard was coming down. The final act of this pathetic charade was about to begin, and I was fully prepared to let them dig their own graves. The dark liquid seeped rapidly through the heavy cotton of my apron, spreading like a dark, bruised shadow over the pristine fabric. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled the air between us, sharp and bitterly metallic. Ashley stood there, bathed in her false sense of absolute superiority. She truly believed she had just delivered a devastating and humiliating physical blow. She expected me to scream. She desperately wanted me to slap her or dissolve into a pathetic puddle of hysterical tears, so she could run straight to Richard and prove I was exactly the unstable, aging housewife they both claimed I was. Instead, I felt a profound icy calm wash over my entire body. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch or back away from her aggressive posture. I slowly untied the soiled apron, letting the ruined fabric slide heavily from my shoulders. I folded it with meticulous care and placed it gently on the edge of the granite island, making absolutely certain that the small front pocket remained completely unobstructed. Nestled deep inside that pocket was a high-definition digital voice recorder. The tiny red indicator light was already blinking steadily in the shadows, capturing every single breath drawn in my silent kitchen. I turned to the stainless steel sink and calmly washed the sticky brown syrup from my shaking hands. You are very young, Ashley, I said softly. My voice was completely devoid of any anger or malice. And when you are young, it is incredibly easy to mistake cheap arrogance for actual unassailable power. She scoffed loudly, shifting her weight aggressively onto one stiletto heel. Save the boring maternal lecture for someone who actually cares, Emily. She crossed her arms tightly over her designer dress, looking around my spotless kitchen with an expression of unconcealed predatory greed. You can act as dignified and superior as you want, but the truth is, you are entirely finished here. Richard is moving on to bigger and better things. Things a woman like you could never possibly understand. I dried my hands slowly on a fresh microfiber cloth and leaned casually against the marble counter. You mean the Heritage Kitchen project, I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and inquisitive. It must be absolutely thrilling for you to work as a junior executive assistant on a $5 million corporate acquisition. She let out a short, grating laugh that echoed unpleasantly off the tile backsplash. I am much more than just a hired assistant. I am his true muse. I am the sole reason he pushes himself to succeed in that suffocating corporate environment. He tells me absolutely everything. I know for a factual certainty he is signing that massive contract today and officially stepping into the executive vice president role. And once that enormous signing bonus clears the bank, he is permanently leaving this boring suburban trap and taking me far away with him. I tilted my head slightly, projecting a flawless mask of mild, defeated confusion. Taking you where exactly? Downtown real estate in this city is astronomically expensive right now. A standard marketing director's salary barely covers the monthly mortgage on this suburban house. The psychological bait was dangling right in front of her perfectly manicured fingertips. Her massive, fragile ego simply could not resist the overwhelming urge to prove me wrong, to show me just how completely she had usurped my financial and romantic position. "That is exactly why you are being permanently replaced," she sneered, stepping much closer to the kitchen island. "You have zero financial vision and no courage. Richard does not need to worry about scraping together a mortgage payment because we already bought our new place outright. We secured a luxury penthouse in the financial district yesterday morning, paid in full with a massive cash down payment." I let a look of devastated fake shock widen my eyes. "A cash down payment for a downtown penthouse? That is legally impossible, Ashley. Richard does not have hundreds of thousands of dollars in liquid cash just lying around in his personal checking accounts." Ashley smiled a wicked, highly triumphant smile. Her painted red lips curled into a vicious, ugly sneer. "You really are exactly as clueless and pathetic as he says you are. He is a brilliant corporate executive, Emily. He knows exactly how to maneuver massive corporate project budgets to his own advantage. He pulled a huge, quiet advance directly from the company expansion fund, specifically to pay for our new home. He said the corporate auditors would not even notice the missing capital until the very end of the fiscal year, and by then, his new executive salary and bonuses will easily cover the tracks." I kept my facial expression perfectly frozen in terror while my heart hammered a steady, powerful rhythm of absolute victory against my ribs. She had just openly confessed to his massive corporate embezzlement on a crystal-clear digital audio recording. But I still needed the final fatal nail in the coffin. I needed her to explicitly admit to the theft of my personal family inheritance. Even a generous corporate advance would not completely cover a luxury downtown penthouse, I pressed, injecting a slight authentic-sounding tremor of desperation into my quiet voice. He must have taken out a massive, risky private loan to cover the rest of the closing costs. She rolled her eyes, letting out a loud theatrical groan of pure exasperation. "God, you really do not pay any attention to the details of your own miserable life, do you? He did not need to take out a high-interest loan because you so generously provided the rest of the necessary capital. He completely cleared out your little joint savings account early this morning. Every last cent of that dusty old trust fund you inherited from your parents went straight into the escrow account for my new condo." He laughed and said it was the only useful thing you ever brought to this entire marriage. The bright kitchen fell dead quiet. The low mechanical hum of the expensive stainless steel refrigerator was the only sound bridging the terrible gap between us. She stood there glowing with malicious toxic pride, waiting eagerly for me to shatter into a million broken pieces. She waited for the horrifying realization that I was utterly destitute to crush my spirit into the hardwood floor. I looked at her heavily made-up face. I looked at the tight designer dress purchased exclusively with my stolen family money. And then I finally smiled. It was not a polite, submissive smile. It was the terrifying, cold smile of an apex predator that had just quietly locked the steel cage door from the inside. "You are absolutely right about one specific thing, Ashley," I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. "I have never paid nearly enough attention to the financial mess accumulating in my own house, but I assure you that unfortunate oversight has been permanently corrected today." Her confident, aggressive posture wavered slightly. The sheer lack of expected panic in my steady voice deeply unsettled her shallow mind. She opened her mouth to deliver another cruel insult, but stopped entirely short when I reached out and gently tapped the dark fabric of my folded apron on the counter. "Do you happen to know the single most important rule of high-level corporate finance, Ashley?" I asked smoothly, stepping around the island. "Always maintain an unassailable, verifiable paper trail, or in this specific case, a pristine digital audio file." I watched with deep satisfaction as the warm color slowly drained from her face as my true meaning finally registered in her brain. I reached deliberately into the apron pocket and pulled out the small black rectangular recorder. The red light blinked cheerfully and continuously in the bright kitchen. I pressed the stop button with a loud, satisfying click. Using corporate expansion funds to purchase private real estate is a severe federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison, I recited, casually tapping the solid device against the granite counter, and maliciously draining a spousal trust fund with forged banking consent documents elevates the entire charge to aggravated wire fraud. I really want to thank you for providing such a clear, incredibly detailed confession of your direct complicity in these massive financial crimes. The district attorney will find your enthusiastic testimony incredibly helpful during the upcoming indictment phase. Ashley stared completely paralyzed at the small black device resting in my steady hand. Her jaw dropped open, but absolutely no sound emerged from her throat. The arrogant, aggressive young girl from 2 minutes ago vanished entirely from the room, replaced by a terrified, trembling child who suddenly realized she was standing barefoot in the middle of a raging inferno. You cannot do that, she finally stammered, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. You are bluffing me. That is completely illegal to record me without my permission. This is my private personal residence, I reminded her, my tone dripping with absolute glacial ice. I have absolutely no expectation of privacy laws protecting hostile intruders who break into my home to openly gloat about committing grand larceny. You have systematically and willingly helped my husband steal my family money and defraud a major international food corporation. You tied yourself enthusiastically to a rapidly sinking ship because you were far too busy admiring the shiny brass fixtures to notice the massive gaping hole in the hull. She stumbled backward in shock, her expensive stiletto heel catching awkwardly on the polished hardwood floor. I did not know, she gasped out, her hands shaking wildly in the air. He told me it was his own personal money. I swear to God I did not know he was actively stealing from the corporation. Feigned ignorance is a historically terrible legal defense, I noted, turning away from her to calmly inspect the lunch preparations simmering on the stove. But you are more than welcome to try pitching that exact story to the federal judge during your arraignment. Now, I highly suggest you go stand very quietly in the formal living room. The chief executive officer will be arriving any minute to carefully review this project. And I would truly hate for you to miss the spectacular dramatic finale of your very short corporate career. At exactly noon, the heavy tires of a black town car crunched against the gravel of our winding suburban driveway. I stood concealed by the sheer curtains of the large bay window in the living room, watching the sleek vehicle come to a smooth halt. The rear door opened, and Harrison Pierce stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. He was a man who commanded absolute authority without ever needing to raise his voice or utter a single syllable. At 60 years old, he possessed a sharp, angular face framed by immaculate iron-gray hair and a gaze that felt piercing enough to cut through solid steel. He wore a meticulously tailored charcoal suit that spoke of generational wealth and quiet, unyielding corporate power. This was the chief executive officer of the entire food conglomerate. He was the man holding a $5 million contract that my husband intended to steal using my life's work. Richard practically sprinted across the front foyer to pull open the heavy oak door before Harrison could even reach the top step of the porch. My husband smoothed his expensive silk tie and plastered on a smile so wide and desperately eager that it made my stomach churn with pure disgust. "Welcome, Mr. Pierce," Richard announced, his voice dripping with an almost embarrassing level of sycophancy. "It is an absolute honor to host you in our home today. Please come right in. We have everything perfectly prepared for the Heritage Kitchen review." Harrison stepped into the grand foyer and offered a brief, curt nod. He did not smile. His sharp eyes immediately scanned the interior of our house, taking in the polished hardwood floors, the expensive artwork, and the minimalist decor funded entirely by my late parents. "Thank you, Richard," Harrison replied, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that echoed slightly in the open space. "I appreciate the invitation to conduct this final assessment in a more private setting. Projects of this financial magnitude require a very personal touch to ensure everything aligns with our corporate vision." I stepped forward from the archway, keeping my posture submissive and my expression pleasantly docile. I took a slow, deliberate breath, channeling the meek, dependent housewife persona my husband expected to see. "Welcome to our home, Mr. Pierce," I said softly, holding out my hands to take his heavy wool overcoat. "I am Emily. It is a genuine pleasure to finally meet you in person." Harrison turned his piercing gaze directly toward me. For a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a flicker of intense calculation in his eyes, a silent recognition that vanished as quickly as it appeared. He handed me his dark coat with a deeply polite nod. "The pleasure is entirely mine, Emily," he said smoothly, maintaining a respectful distance. Your home is quite beautiful." Before I could offer a gracious reply, Richard aggressively stepped between us, physically blocking me from the chief executive officer. My husband placed a heavy, condescending hand on my shoulder and squeezed it tightly. It was a silent physical warning disguised as a gesture of marital affection. "Yes, well, Emily does her best to keep things tidy around here." Richard chuckled, a hollow, arrogant sound that grated against my ears. "But let us not waste your highly valuable time on domestic pleasantries, sir. We have a massive industry disrupting acquisition to discuss. Emily, be a good girl and run along to the kitchen now. Bring out the sparkling water and make sure those appetizers are ready. The men have serious corporate business to handle." The sheer disrespect in his tone was staggering. He was casually dismissing me like a hired servant in my own house, right in front of the man he was desperately trying to impress. I felt a surge of hot, burning fury flare deep in my chest. The urge to rip the stolen presentation out of his manicured hands and expose his massive embezzlement, right then and there, was almost overwhelming. But the seasoned financial auditor inside me maintained absolute icy control over my emotions. A premature strike would completely ruin the trap I had carefully laid. I lowered my eyes, offering a weak, obedient smile. "Of course, honey," I whispered, retreating toward the kitchen without uttering another word. From the safety of the kitchen, I left the heavy wooden door cracked open just enough to see and hear everything unfolding in the formal living room. Richard guided Harrison to the center of the room, where a large digital screen had been set up next to a sleek glass coffee table. Richard puffed out his chest, projecting the false, unwavering confidence of a visionary founder. He tapped a button on his remote, and the bright title slide for Heritage Kitchen illuminated the dimly lit room. "Mr. Pierce, this ambitious project represents the absolute pinnacle of organic food preservation." Richard began, his voice swelling with practiced theatrical pride. "For the past 3 years, I have spent every waking hour outside the office developing these proprietary formulas. I saw a massive gap in the market for shelf-stable health foods, and I personally engineered a supply chain model that will increase our corporate profit margins by 20% in the first fiscal year alone." I gripped the edge of the cold granite kitchen counter until my knuckles turned stark white. Listening to him openly claim sole credit for my grueling late-night research, my complex mathematical forecasting, and my chemical stabilization formulas was a unique kind of psychological torture. He spoke with such absolute conviction that a lesser person might have actually believed his outrageous lies. He confidently rattled off the executive summary I had written, quoting my own precise market projections back to the room. Harrison sat in the luxurious leather armchair, leaning forward with his hands clasped firmly together. He listened intently, his face an unreadable mask of corporate stoicism. He did not interrupt, but his eyes tracked Richard's every movement with the predatory patience of a hawk watching a frantic field mouse. I arranged the delicate goat cheese and fig tartlets onto a polished silver serving tray. I took a deep, steadying breath, balancing the heavy tray on my palm, and pushed the kitchen door open. I walked softly into the living room, approaching the glass coffee table to serve our distinguished guest. I bent down to place a crystal glass of sparkling water near Harrison. "Ah, perfect timing," Richard interrupted, pausing his presentation to glare down at me with unconcealed annoyance. "Just set the tray down and head straight back to the kitchen, Emily. I need absolute silence to walk Mr. Pierce through the chemical breakdown of the natural preservatives. It is highly technical material, and I simply cannot afford any domestic distractions right now." He waved his hand at me in a dismissive shooing motion, treating me with such blatant patriarchal disdain that the air in the room grew instantly thick with heavy tension. He was so drunk on his own impending financial success that he wanted to humiliate me completely before discarding me. "My wife is a wonderful cook, Mr. Pierce," Richard added with a smug, self-satisfied grin. "But when it comes to million-dollar corporate acquisitions, she is entirely out of her depth. We prefer to keep her safely behind the stove where she truly belongs." I did not flinch. I did not glare at him. I simply placed the silver tray gently on the table and offered Harrison a polite, silent nod. Harrison glanced at the intricate appetizers, then looked up at my arrogant husband. The older man's jaw tightened slightly, and his gray eyes grew noticeably colder. I turned around and walked quietly back to my kitchen, leaving the door cracked open once again. I leaned against the counter, a dark, triumphant smile finally breaking across my face. Richard had set the stage perfectly. He had built a massive, sparring monument of arrogance and stolen genius. He had absolutely no idea that in just a few short moments, the entire structure was going to collapse directly onto his head. I pushed the swinging kitchen door open with my shoulder, balancing the heavy silver tray perfectly on my left palm. The formal living room felt like a theatrical stage, and I was stepping right into the blinding spotlight. Richard was standing by the digital display, gesturing expansively as he rambled about brand synergy and demographic reach. He sounded exactly like a man who had memorized a corporate brochure without understanding a single fundamental concept behind the printed words. Harrison Pierce sat deep in the luxurious leather armchair. The billionaire executive looked thoroughly unimpressed by the endless marketing buzzwords. His sharp gray eyes darted toward me as I approached the low glass coffee table. I kept my gaze deferential, playing the quiet suburban housewife to absolute perfection. I gently set down a porcelain plate of warm goat cheese and caramelized fig tartlets right in front of him. I also poured a chilled glass of sparkling water, adding a single twist of organic lemon. Richard scowled at me, clearly irritated by the domestic interruption. He waved his manicured hand silently, ordering me to retreat to the kitchen immediately. I offered a polite, submissive nod and backed away, but I deliberately left the heavy wooden door cracked open just an inch. I stood in the dark kitchen hallway, pressing my ear against the narrow gap, waiting for the interrogation to begin. The sound of a silver fork clinking against fine porcelain echoed loudly in the quiet living room. Harrison had taken a slow, deliberate bite of the tartlet. A long, heavy silence stretched across the open space. I held my breath in the shadows. I had spent countless months perfecting the delicate balance of acidity and sweetness in that specific recipe, using the exact organic stabilization techniques outlined in the Heritage Kitchen portfolio. Finally, Harrison let out a low, appreciative hum of approval. "The culinary execution is truly exceptional, Richard," the older man said, his deep voice cutting right through the lingering marketing pitch of my husband. "The flavor profile is undeniably brilliant, but we are not here today to open a boutique suburban bakery. We are here to discuss a massive national rollout for a major corporation. If you want $5 million of my capital, you need to prove this concept can scale safely without compromising the organic integrity. I want to move past the glossy executive summary. Let us talk about the hard operational mechanics." Richard cleared his throat loudly. I could practically hear the sudden spike of sheer panic rattling in his chest. "Of course, Mr. Pierce." Richard stammered, his smooth practiced confidence faltering for the very first time this afternoon. "We have a highly robust strategy for national distribution." Harrison leaned forward, clasping his large hands tightly together over his knees. "Do not give me generic business jargon," Richard, the chief executive officer, warned. His tone was as cold and sharp as a winter frost. "I want precise, verifiable figures. Break down the localized farm cooperative logistics for me right now. How exactly are you planning to leverage regional agriculture hubs to completely bypass the national distributors? What is the exact percentage drop in overhead warehouse costs when we implement this localized supply chain model across the Midwest region?" Richard stood completely frozen in the center of our living room. He opened his mouth, closed it, and opened it again like a suffocating fish. Those operational logistics were the core financial engine of my business plan. I had spent 3 grueling years calculating those exact cooperative supply chain metrics, relentlessly cross-referencing commercial freight costs and seasonal agricultural yields. Richard had never bothered to read the technical appendix of my proposal. He only cared about the title page and the projected executive bonus he planned to steal. "Well, sir, the cooperative strategy is highly fluid." Richard choked out a thick, ugly bead of sweat rolling rapidly down his temple. "We anticipate significant corporate savings across the board once we finalize the local vendor partnerships later this year." "Significant savings is not a mathematical number." Harrison barked, his professional patience instantly evaporating into thin air. "You supposedly wrote this comprehensive proposal, Richard. You should know your profit margins down to the exact decimal point without needing to check a screen." The tension in the living room was rapidly becoming suffocating. I gripped the edge of the cold granite kitchen counter, a dark, triumphant smile slowly spreading across my face. Richard was actively drowning in his own stolen lies, and Harrison Pierce was tossing him heavy steel anvils instead of life preservers. But the ruthless billionaire executive was not finished dismantling my husband. He stood up, towering over the terrified marketing director. "Fine, let us skip the supply chain logistics for a moment," Harrison said, taking a deliberate step toward the glowing digital display. "Let us discuss the hard science. The entire valuation of the Heritage Kitchen brand rests completely on your proprietary organic preservatives. You claim this natural formula provides a 2-year shelf life without ever utilizing synthetic chemicals. Explain the chemical stabilization process to me immediately. How are you maintaining cellular integrity in the organic compounds while simultaneously preventing harmful microbial growth? Break down the molecular chemical structure for me right now." Richard turned the sickly color of pale chalk. The arrogant, untouchable marketing director, the exact same man who had mocked me mercilessly at our anniversary dinner last night, now looked like a terrified, helpless child facing a firing squad. He had absolutely zero background in advanced food science or complex organic chemistry. He could not even distinguish between a simple carbohydrate chain and a complex protein structure. He frantically grabbed his expensive silver tablet from the table, his sweaty fingers slipping clumsily against the smooth glass screen. He desperately hoped to find a cheat sheet hidden somewhere in the presentation notes. I watched his pathetic struggle from the safety of my kitchen war room. His beautiful, inevitable destruction finally began unfolding right before my eyes. The tension in our formal living room was thick enough to suffocate a person. I stood perfectly still behind the slightly open kitchen door, watching the spectacular collapse of my husband. Harrison Pierce did not raise his voice, but the sheer weight of his executive authority pressed down on Richard like a physical force. The billionaire chief executive officer sat back in his leather chair and waited for an answer to his highly technical question about the organic supply chain profit margins. I had spent 3 grueling years calculating those exact metrics. I knew the numbers by heart. Richard did not. Richard cleared his throat loudly. The confident, arrogant marketing director who had mocked my intelligence just last night was completely gone. In his place stood a terrified man, realizing he was trapped in a lie. "Well, sir, the margins are highly dynamic." Richard stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "We fully anticipate a robust synergistic growth factor across the entire 4th quarter. We plan to leverage our primary demographics to offset any localized transportation deficits." I pressed my hand against my mouth to stifle a bitter laugh. Synergistic growth factor. He was throwing out meaningless marketing buzzwords to answer a rigid mathematical question. It was exactly like trying to pay a mortgage with monopoly money. Harrison Pierce narrowed his steely gray eyes. The older man leaned forward, steepling his fingers together. "I am not asking you for a marketing pitch," Richard Harrison said, his tone dropping to a dangerous icy register. "I am asking you a basic financial question about the business plan you supposedly wrote. If we switch to localized farm cooperatives, what is the exact percentage drop in our national warehouse overhead? Give me the projected gross margin." A heavy bead of sweat broke out on his forehead. He wiped it away frantically with the back of his manicured hand. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his expensive navy suit suddenly looking like a borrowed costume. The silence stretched out, agonizing and absolute. He opened his mouth, but only a sharp, breathless gasp came out. "I estimate a gross margin of roughly 12%. Richard blurted out in a blind panic. "Yes, 12%, due to the amortization of the delivery fleet." My jaw clenched. 12% was a catastrophic failure for an organic food venture. My actual calculated margin was 28%. Amortization had absolutely nothing to do with localized warehouse overhead. He was digging his own grave with every single word he spoke. Harrison stared at him with an expression of profound, unconcealed disgust. 12%, the chief executive officer repeated slowly. "You are sitting in front of me, asking for $5 million of my capital, and you are pitching a margin that barely covers the current inflation rate. Furthermore, amortization is an accounting practice regarding intangible assets. It has nothing to do with physical delivery trucks. Do you even understand the fundamental financial terms you are using right now?" Richard turned the color of pale chalk. He looked desperately around the room, as if hoping the walls would magically provide him with the correct answers. He glanced toward Ashley, his young assistant, who was sitting frozen on the edge of the sofa. She stared back at him with wide, terrified eyes, completely incapable of helping him. She was there to play the role of the devoted mistress, not to solve complex corporate finance equations. The sheer panic in his eyes finally pushed him to take drastic action. He offered Harrison a weak, trembling smile. "I apologize, Mr. Pierce. The specific regional numbers are quite dense. Let me just pull up the raw data charts to give you the exact decimal points. I have everything perfectly detailed right here." Richard reached down with shaking hands and picked up his silver corporate tablet from the glass coffee table. He gripped the device like a drowning man clutching a life preserver. I watched him from the shadows of my kitchen, my heart pounding a steady, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. He was about to rely on the intellectual property he had stolen from me. He was about to open the core document files where I had meticulously stored every single equation, every chemical formula, and every financial projection. He tapped the screen to wake it up. He swiped upward to bypass the lock screen. The tablet prompted him for the master encryption password to access the secured corporate drive. Richard did not hesitate. He quickly typed in the familiar numeric sequence he had used for years. He expected the bright blue folders to populate the screen instantly. He expected to read my brilliant work and present it as his own genius. Instead, the tablet screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving shade of red. I leaned closer to the crack in the door, my eyes fixed on the device in his hands. I knew exactly what those bold white letters on the screen said. "Access denied." Richard let out a sharp, breathless gasp. He tapped the screen frantically, his fingers slipping against the smooth glass. He deleted the entry and typed the password again, pressing each digit with aggressive, desperate force. He hit the enter button. The screen flashed red once more. "Access denied." "What is wrong with this thing?" Richard muttered under his breath, his voice laced with pure hysteria. He tried a third time, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the expensive device onto the hardwood floor. The loud, angry beep of the tablet rejecting his password echoed through the silent living room. Last night, while he was sleeping soundly after openly humiliating me in front of his friends, I had locked myself in the bathroom and methodically changed every single administrative password on his cloud server. I had locked the gates to my empire. "Mr. Pierce, I am having a slight technical malfunction today." Richard choked out, his face now dripping with cold sweat. The server must be down. The glowing red screen of the silver tablet illuminated Richard's pale, terrified face like a warning beacon. The words "access denied" flashed relentlessly, offering him absolutely no escape from the trap I had carefully laid the night before. The silence in our formal living room was suddenly so thick and oppressive, it felt like all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of the house. Harrison Pierce sat perfectly still in his luxurious leather chair. The billionaire chief executive officer did not blink. He did not offer a single word of encouragement. He simply waited with the terrifying patience of an apex predator for my husband to answer a complex chemical stabilization question that Richard fundamentally did not understand. My husband tapped the glass screen one more time, his sweaty fingers slipping clumsily. The machine let out a sharp, angry rejection beep. The sound echoed off the high ceiling like a judge striking a heavy wooden gavel. Richard was officially cornered. He could not access my encrypted files. He could not steal my intellectual property to save his sinking ship. And his massive, fragile ego simply could not process the reality of his own staggering incompetence. He was a man who had spent his entire life taking credit for my hard work. So when faced with a catastrophic failure, he did exactly what weak, arrogant men always do. He immediately looked for a woman to blame. Richard spun around on his heel and glared fiercely at Ashley. His 24-year-old assistant was sitting rigidly on the edge of the sofa, looking like a frightened animal caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming truck. Ashley Richard barked, his voice cracking with a sickening mixture of raw panic and vicious anger. "Where are the secondary backup files? I explicitly told you to prepare the hard copy binders with the complete molecular breakdowns. Why are they not sitting on this table right now?" Ashley physically flinched backward, her shoulders hitting the cushions. The smug, arrogant girl who had stood in my kitchen just an hour ago mocking my age and deliberately ruining my clothes was now trembling violently under his furious gaze. Richard was ruthlessly throwing her directly under the bus to save his own skin. "I do not have them," Ashley stammered, her confident voice shrinking into a pathetic, terrified squeak. "You never gave me any chemical data files, Richard. You only gave me the glossy marketing brochures to print." "Do not lie to me in front of Mr. Pierce," Richard roared, completely abandoning any lingering shred of his polished professional composure. He stepped aggressively toward her, towering over the frightened young woman. "I gave you explicit detailed instructions this morning. You are completely incompetent. You forgot to sync the main server, and now you are intentionally ruining the most important presentation of my entire career." I watched this entire pathetic display from the narrow crack in the kitchen door, a dark, bitter smile touching my lips. It was incredibly poetic justice unfolding right before my eyes. Ashley had eagerly helped him embezzle my family inheritance to buy her a luxury downtown penthouse. She genuinely thought she was his brilliant equal and his beloved muse. Now she was experiencing the exact same toxic belittlement I had endured quietly for 14 years. She was learning the hard way that a man who will easily betray his devoted wife will eventually turn around and betray his mistress without a single second thought. The intense public yelling pushed Ashley into a state of total blind panic. She scrambled frantically to open the leather presentation folders resting on the sleek glass coffee table, desperately hoping to miraculously find a stray piece of paper that would calm his escalating rage. Her manicured hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the thick cardboard covers. "Find the correct documents right now," Richard commanded, suddenly slamming his heavy fist down against the edge of the table. The sudden violent impact made Ashley jump completely out of her skin. Her hand shot forward blindly and collided directly with the large ceramic mug of dark roast coffee I had served earlier. The heavy mug tipped over instantly. A thick wave of scalding dark liquid cascaded across the smooth glass surface. It poured directly onto the pristine printed sample contracts of the Heritage Kitchen project. The dark brown coffee soaked rapidly through the thick, expensive white paper, ruining the custom binding and blurring the black ink into an illegible, muddy mess. "Oh my God!" Ashley shrieked, jumping back wildly as the hot coffee splashed onto her bare legs and her expensive designer dress. She frantically grabbed a handful of small, inadequate cocktail napkins, trying uselessly to dab at the ruined documents. Her panicked wiping only ended up tearing the soggy important papers into useless wet shreds. Harrison Pierce watched this chaotic, embarrassing spectacle with an expression of profound glacial disgust. The chief executive officer did not yell. He did not lose his temper or raise his voice. The quiet calm of a truly powerful man is infinitely more terrifying than any loud, desperate tantrum. Harrison simply reached out and pushed his leather briefcase closed, securing the heavy brass clasps with a sharp, definitive click. That single sound cut cleanly through Ashley's hysterical, tearful apologies and Richard's frantic, aggressive yelling. Both of them froze instantly, turning their horrified attention back to the billionaire. Harrison stood up slowly, towering over the pathetic scene of ruined papers and spilled coffee. He buttoned his tailored charcoal suit jacket, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his lapel. He looked down at Richard with a gaze so incredibly cold it could have frozen a raging river in midsummer. "I came to your home today expecting to finalize a massive corporate acquisition," Harrison said, his deep, gravelly voice vibrating with absolute disdain. "I expected to sit across from a visionary leader, a man capable of navigating complex logistical challenges and leading a national team. Instead, I am sitting in a circus watching a grown man throw a pathetic temper tantrum and verbally abuse his junior assistant because he does not understand his own business proposal." Richard turned the sickly color of spoiled milk. "Mr. Pierce, please. I sincerely apologize for this mess," he begged, holding his trembling hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. "The project is solid. The product is revolutionary. If you just give me one more hour to pull the correct files from the main server, I can prove the profit margins to you." "You do not have another hour," Richard, the chief executive officer, stated, walking deliberately toward the grand entryway of the house. "A true leader knows his product inside and out. A true leader takes absolute responsibility for his team's shortcomings. You have demonstrated a complete lack of basic financial knowledge, a staggering lack of professional preparation, and an appalling lack of basic human decency in how you treat your staff." Harrison paused by the heavy oak front door, turning back to deliver the final fatal blow. The Heritage Kitchen project is officially cancelled. I am taking my $5 million investment capital elsewhere. Do not bother returning to the corporate office on Monday morning, Richard. Your tenure as marketing director is suspended pending a full review by the executive board. We are completely finished here. The front door opened and shut with a resounding thud. Harrison Pierce was gone, and the $5 million sentence had been carried out to perfection. Richard collapsed onto the living room sofa, burying his face in his hands, letting out a loud, agonizing groan of pure defeat. The trap had sprung flawlessly, and the arrogant marketing director had been utterly destroyed by his own staggering incompetence. The click of Harrison Pierce closing his leather briefcase sounded like a gunshot in the silent living room. The chief executive officer stood up, his face carved from stone, radiating pure disappointment. Richard was practically on his knees, dripping cold sweat, babbling useless apologies that meant nothing to a man who controlled a multi-billion-dollar empire. My husband had humiliated himself, proving he lacked even the most basic understanding of the project he claimed to have built. Harrison turned his back, buttoning his tailored charcoal suit jacket with decisive movements. The $5 million executive deal was now officially dead. I stood in the shadows of the kitchen hallway, watching the spectacular collapse of my treacherous husband. For 14 years, I had shrunk myself down to fit into the tiny box he created for me. I had swallowed my pride and poured my entire soul into supporting a man who planned to leave me destitute. My heart pounded a furious rhythm against my ribs, but it was no longer the frantic heartbeat of a terrified victim. It was the powerful pulse of a woman reclaiming her strength. I looked down at the heavy cotton apron tied tightly around my waist. I reached behind my back and untied the thick knot. I slid the apron over my head, feeling a profound physical release as the heavy fabric left my shoulders. I tossed the soiled apron onto a mahogany dining chair. It landed with a soft thud, marking the exact moment the submissive housewife officially ceased to exist. I smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored navy trousers, lifted my chin, and took a deep breath. I pushed the swinging wooden door wide open and walked directly into the middle of the living room. The sunlight poured brightly through large windows. My sudden appearance in the center of the formal room shattered the heavy silence. Richard whipped his head around, his eyes wide with shock and immediate fury. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk collar. "Emily, what are you doing?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "Get back in the kitchen right now. You are embarrassing me." He waved his hand aggressively, pointing toward the hallway like a master ordering a disobedient dog to return. Just yesterday, that sharp command would have sent me retreating. Today, his voice sounded as weak and meaningless as a buzzing insect. I did not flinch. I did not retreat. I completely ignored his existence and turned my gaze directly toward the towering figure of the billionaire executive. "Mr. Pierce, please wait," I called out. My voice was perfectly calm, clear, and modulated. It was the voice of the senior financial analyst. I used to be a woman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated complex mergers long before I ever learned how to bake organic sourdough. Harrison stopped dead in his tracks just inches from the front door. He turned around slowly, his thick gray eyebrows pulling together in a frown of confusion. He looked at me, trying to comprehend why the quiet woman who served him goat cheese tartlets was suddenly speaking with such absolute authority. I walked confidently toward the glass coffee table, stepping right past my trembling husband and his terrified young mistress. The localized farm cooperative strategy reduces our national warehouse overhead by exactly 18.4%. I stated clearly, answering the logistical question Richard had fumbled moments ago. By bypassing traditional national distributors and contracting directly with regional organic agriculture hubs in the Midwest, we eliminate the secondary transportation tariffs, entirely preserving our bottom-line profit margins. This localized supply chain model creates a protective buffer against seasonal fuel inflation, ensuring our gross margin remains incredibly stable at 28.7%, even during wildly fluctuating economic markets. Harrison Pierce went completely still. The annoyance vanished from his weathered face, replaced instantly by a look of profound calculating shock. He released the brass handle of his heavy briefcase and let it rest gently against his leg. He took a slow, deliberate step back into the living room. his piercing grey eyes locking onto mine with an intense burning curiosity that would have intimidated a lesser woman. But I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, meeting his gaze with absolute professional confidence. Richard let out a loud gasp of pure panic. He lunged forward, trying to grab my arm, but I smoothly stepped out of his reach without breaking eye contact with the chief executive officer. Furthermore, the initial rollout phase does not rely on asset amortization. As my husband foolishly suggested, I continued, my voice gaining strength as the complex numbers flowed effortlessly from memory. The projected earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization sit comfortably at $4.2 million for the year. We achieved this by optimizing the raw material intake schedules, reducing factory floor idle time by 12%. Every single dollar is accounted for, Mr. Pierce. The financial modeling is completely airtight, built to scale across all 50 states within 36 months without ever compromising the strict organic certification standards. Shut your mouth, Emily. Richard roared, completely losing the last shred of his fabricated professional composure. His face was a horrifying mask of desperation and blistering anger. He turned wildly to Harrison, waving his manicured hands in the air. "Sir, I sincerely apologize. My wife is completely, utterly unwell." I offered the older man a gracious nod of acknowledgement before delivering the final blow to Richard's web of stolen lies. With the composure of a former financial analyst, I perfectly answered each of his remaining tricky questions, quoting precise profit figures. The formal living room fell into a breathtaking, absolute silence. The only sound was the rapid, shallow breathing of my ruined husband as he realized he had just lost everything. Harrison Pierce stood in the center of the room, looking at me as if he were seeing a brilliant, undiscovered diamond hidden in the rough dirt. "Shut your mouth right now and get back into the kitchen where you belong." Richard roared the words so loudly that the crystal glasses on the dining table actually vibrated. His face had turned a dangerous shade of crimson, and the veins in his neck were bulging against his expensive silk collar. He took a heavy step toward me, raising his hand as if he wanted to physically push me out of the formal living room. For 14 years, that exact tone of voice would have sent me running. That booming patriarchal command was designed to make me feel small, foolish, and completely dependent on his approval. He looked at me with a mixture of absolute hatred and wild panic, desperately trying to salvage his crumbling $5 million lie. "Please excuse my wife, Mr. Pierce," Richard stammered, spinning around to face the billionaire chief executive officer. "She has been incredibly unwell lately. Her nerves are completely shot, and she gets these terrible hysterical episodes where she just babbles absolute nonsense. I will have my assistant escort her upstairs immediately so we can finish our corporate acquisition in peace." I did not retreat. I did not lower my gaze or apologize for interrupting the men. I stood perfectly still in the center of the sunlit room, planting my feet firmly on the expensive hardwood floor. The heavy, suffocating chains of my marriage simply fell away from my shoulders. I felt an incredible surge of pure, cold power rushing through my veins. The financial analyst, who had once commanded executive boardrooms, was fully awake, and she was ready to close the most important deal of her entire life. "I am not unwell, Richard," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm and steady register. "And I am absolutely done standing in the kitchen while you steal my life's work." I walked deliberately toward the sleek glass coffee table, completely ignoring my husband as he tried to grab my arm. I slipped past his desperate grasp with a graceful, fluid motion. My eyes were locked directly onto Harrison Pierce. The older man stood tall and imposing, watching me with an intense, piercing curiosity. Before Richard could utter another pathetic excuse, I reached underneath the lower shelf of the heavy coffee table. Just before the guests had arrived, I had securely taped a thick, waterproof envelope hidden completely out of sight. I ripped the envelope free with a sharp, satisfying tear. I pulled out a dark blue leather-bound portfolio. It was heavy, filled with the undeniable weight of absolute truth. I lifted the portfolio high in the air and brought it down hard onto the glass table. The loud, explosive smack echoed through the entire house. "If you want to purchase the Heritage Kitchen project, Mr. Pierce, you are currently talking to the wrong person," I announced, projecting my voice with absolute crystal-clear authority. My husband did not engineer the organic supply chain. He did not calculate the regional cooperative profit margins, and he certainly did not formulate the complex chemical structures for the natural preservatives. He is nothing but a fraudulent middleman trying to sell you stolen property. Richard let out a choked, desperate gasp. "Emily, are you out of your mind?" he hissed, stepping forward with his hands clenched into tight, angry fists. "You are going to ruin everything. Stop spouting these insane lies right now." I flipped the heavy leather cover of the portfolio open, pushing it directly across the smooth glass toward Harrison. "I am not the one who lies, Richard," I stated coldly. "Mr. Pierce, please review the first document." I instructed, keeping my posture perfectly straight and professional. "That is the official limited liability company registration certificate for Heritage Kitchen filed at the state level. You will clearly see that it was legally incorporated 3 entire years ago. The sole registered founder and holding director is Emily Pierce. My husband does not own a single share of equity in this corporate entity." Harrison Pierce reached out with the steady weathered hand and picked up the official registration. He examined the raised golden seal and the authorized signatures with the meticulous scrutiny of a veteran auditor. He did not say a single word, but the slight tightening of his jaw and the cold, dark shadow that fell over his gray eyes spoke volumes. He was a man who despised liars, and he had just caught one red-handed in the most spectacular fashion possible. "Now look at the second page." I continued turning the document over with a swift, confident motion. "Those are the federal trademark rights and the approved intellectual property patents for the exact organic preservative formulas you were questioning earlier. They are legally registered exclusively under my name. I liquidated my own personal trust fund inherited from my deceased parents to completely finance the research and development phase. I spent 3 grueling years chemically balancing those formulas in the very kitchen my husband just ordered me to return to." Richard was hyperventilating now. His chest heaved up and down as he stared at the legal documents proving his massive deception. "Sir, it is a joint marital asset," he stammered wildly, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "She is my legal wife. What belongs to her belongs to me. We built this together as a family." "Do not dare insult my intelligence, Richard," I snapped, cutting off his pathetic lie with ruthless precision. I flipped to the final section of the thick portfolio. Here is the certified digital metadata report extracted directly from the core project files, Mr. Pierce. It verifies the exact dates, times, and keystroke authorship of every single financial projection and business model in this proposal. The data undeniably proves that I personally authored every single word of the executive summary and the supply chain logistics. Richard simply copied the finalized files last week and clumsily deleted my name from the title slides. I stood tall, radiating the undeniable power of a woman who had just reclaimed her entire stolen empire. The heavy leather portfolio sat squarely in the center of the glass coffee table. It felt like a ticking bomb that had just detonated in my formal living room. Richard stared at the dark blue cover as if it were a poisonous snake. His chest heaved in rapid, shallow bursts. He had spent the morning demanding a flawless lunch, commanding me to stay hidden, treating me like an incompetent servant. Now the absolute proof of my ownership and his massive fraud rested right in front of the billionaire chief executive officer he had tried to impress. I stood my ground. My posture was perfectly straight. I did not break eye contact with Harrison Pierce. I watched the older man reach out with a steady, weathered hand to open the portfolio. The room fell into a breathtaking silence. It was so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Ashley, the young assistant, who had mocked me just hours ago, was practically shrinking into the sofa cushions. She looked completely terrified, finally realizing the stolen empire she wanted to inherit did not actually belong to my husband. Harrison turned the crisp pages one by one. He examined the raised golden seal of the limited liability company registration. He read the federal trademark documents. He scrutinized the digital metadata reports, verifying my authorship of the entire $5 million project. With every page, he turned the suffocating arrogance that defined Richard for 14 years melted away into pure, unadulterated panic. My husband took a trembling step forward. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely trapped in a corner of his own making. Harrison finally closed the thick portfolio. He rested his large hands on the leather cover. For a long moment, he did not say a single word. He simply looked down at the table. Then something incredible happened. A slow, deeply satisfied smile began to spread across the chief executive officer's stern face. It was not a polite corporate smile. It was a look of profound respect and genuine amusement, the kind of expression a seasoned chess grandmaster makes when he witnesses a brilliant, unexpected checkmate. "Mr. Pierce, please listen to me," Richard suddenly blurted out. His voice was a high, desperate squeak. "Those documents are completely fabricated. She printed those out this morning to sabotage me. My wife is deeply unwell. She's suffering from a severe psychological breakdown. I am the true visionary behind the Heritage Kitchen brand. You have to believe me." Harrison slowly lifted his gaze. He looked at Richard with an expression of pure glacial disgust. The older man shook his head, letting out a short, humorless laugh that echoed against the high ceiling. "You truly are a pathetic, arrogant fool, Richard," Harrison said. His deep, gravelly voice cut through my husband's desperate lies with absolute authority. "Do you honestly believe that a multinational food conglomerate would hand you a $5 million executive contract without conducting a rigorous background investigation?" Richard froze. The sickly pale color of his face turned completely gray. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of a heavy armchair. "We do not write blind checks, Richard." Harrison continued stepping away from the glass table and walking directly toward me. My corporate legal team spent the entire previous week conducting a comprehensive due diligence audit on the Heritage Kitchen intellectual property. We dug into the federal patent databases. We verified the trademark registries. We hired independent forensic accountants to trace the original funding used for the research and development phase. Harrison stopped just a few feet away from me. He looked at me with an overwhelming sense of professional admiration. "And do you know what my legal team found, Richard?" Harrison asked, without looking away from me. "They found Emily. They discovered that every single patent, every single organic formula, and every single financial projection was legally registered to the brilliant woman standing right here. We knew from the very beginning that the true owner and the sole creative genius behind this entire enterprise was your wife." The revelation hit the room like a massive tidal wave, a cinematic, completely unexpected twist that I had never anticipated. I let out a gasp of surprise. I spent the entire night frantically downloading files and contacting my private lawyer to stop Richard from stealing my work. I thought I was fighting this brutal war entirely alone. I had absolutely no idea that the billionaire executive standing in my living room had already uncovered the truth days ago. "Then why did you come here today?" Richard choked out. He fell to his knees on the hardwood floor, completely stripped of his pride. "If you already knew the project belonged to her, why did you agree to come to my house and listen to my presentation?" Harrison looked down at the trembling, broken man. "I came here today for one specific reason, Richard," the chief executive officer stated coldly. "I came to look you directly in the eye and see exactly how long a terrible, deceitful husband could keep up this pathetic charade. I wanted to witness the true depth of your sheer incompetence. You stood in this beautiful home, drinking my sparkling water, and confidently took credit for years of grueling research that you never even read. You tried to sell me a stolen empire while treating the actual architect like a common maid. An incredible surge of vindication washed over my entire body. The man who sneered at me, who called me useless and foolish, was now kneeling on the floor in absolute disgrace. He was publicly exposed as a fraud by the most powerful man in his industry. Harrison turned his full attention back to me. His stern face softened into a look of absolute respect. The fearful, dependent housewife was dead and gone. In her place stood the true founder of Heritage Kitchen, ready to claim her throne. The revelation hung in the bright suburban living room like a massive physical weight. Harrison Pierce had just dismantled my husband's entire existence with a few calm and measured sentences. Richard remained on his knees against the hardwood floor. The man who had spent 14 years demanding my absolute submission was now gasping for air as if he were drowning. His tailored navy suit looked suddenly absurd, a hollow costume draping a pathetic fraud. I watched his chest heave as he stared up at the billionaire executive. Richard opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords seemed completely paralyzed. The arrogant marketing director had finally run out of lies to tell. Over by the sofa, his young mistress Ashley sat frozen in terror. The coffee she had spilled was still dripping slowly off the edge of the glass table, pooling onto the expensive wool rug. She realized her dream of living in a luxury penthouse funded by my stolen inheritance was currently evaporating into thin air. Harrison completely ignored the broken man groveling near his expensive leather shoes. The chief executive officer turned his broad shoulders away from Richard and directed his full undivided attention to me. The sheer professional respect radiating from his steely gray eyes was something I had not experienced in over a decade. He reached down and picked up his heavy leather briefcase from the floor. He set it gently on the glass coffee table right next to the blue portfolio containing my intellectual property patents. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches opening echoed loudly through the silent house. It was a crisp and definitive sound. It was the sound of a brand new chapter beginning. Harrison reached deep inside the velvet-lined compartment of his briefcase. He did not pull out a standard marketing assessment or a preliminary non-disclosure agreement. He withdrew a thick stack of legal documents bound in a dark gray corporate folder. The paper was heavy, official, and pristine. He placed the folder squarely on the glass surface and slid it across the table. He pushed it right past Richard's trembling, sweaty hands. He pushed it until the thick document came to a rest directly in front of me. I looked down at the bold printed letters on the cover page. It was a formal corporate acquisition and executive employment agreement. Emily Harrison began, his deep baritone voice filling the room with absolute unwavering authority. My corporate legal team and my board of directors have spent the last 72 hours meticulously reviewing your heritage kitchen portfolio. We ran your chemical stabilization formulas through our independent laboratory testing. Your organic preservative models are completely flawless. Your localized supply chain logistics are utterly brilliant. You have single-handedly solved a major distribution crisis that my highest-paid executives have spent years trying to figure out. You possess exactly the kind of rare visionary talent that our global conglomerate desperately requires to move into the future. I stood perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his words. This was the ultimate validation I had sacrificed my entire youth to achieve. Harrison tapped a thick silver pen against the top of the contract. This document is a formal acquisition agreement for the exclusive rights to the Heritage Kitchen brand, he stated clearly. We are offering you a lump sum buyout of $5 million for the proprietary intellectual property. But more importantly, we are not simply buying your recipes. We are acquiring your leadership. Section 4 of this contract outlines your immediate employment offer. We want you to step in as the Chief Executive Officer of the newly formed Heritage Kitchen Division. You will have a corner office at our downtown headquarters, full executive health benefits, a generous profit-sharing margin, and complete creative control over the national rollout. A strangled, pathetic noise escaped from Richard's throat. He scrambled forward on his knees, his hands reaching desperately toward the edge of the coffee table. "Mr. Pierce, you cannot do this!" Richard pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine. "She is my wife. This is my house. I brought this massive project to your attention. You cannot just cut me out of the deal like this. I am the marketing director of this company. I deserve the executive promotion. I demand a seat at the table and a share of that buyout." Harrison did not even bother to look down at him. The billionaire simply adjusted his tailored suit jacket and delivered a ruthless verbal execution. "You demand absolutely nothing," Richard Harrison said, his voice dropping to a glacial, terrifying register. "You are a corporate thief, an embarrassment, and a monumental liability. You attempted to sell me stolen assets and defraud my company right to my face. Our Human Resources Department has already drafted your immediate termination paperwork. You will be clearing out your desk this afternoon under the strict supervision of our armed corporate security team. If you ever attempt to contact me, or if you ever interfere with this woman's new executive position, I will personally unleash an army of corporate litigators to bury you so deeply in civil lawsuits that you will never secure employment in this industry again. You are entirely finished here." Richard slumped backward against the sofa cushions, burying his red face in his trembling hands. A loud, wet sob tore from his chest. The great, untouchable patriarch had been reduced to a weeping, ruined mess. Ashley scrambled away from him, pressing her back against the far wall, looking at the man she thought was a powerful genius with open disgust. I looked away from them both, feeling absolutely no pity in my heart. I picked up the thick gray folder from the glass table and opened it. The crisp pages were filled with complex corporate legal jargon, but to my trained analytical eyes, it was beautiful, flawless poetry. It was a map leading directly to my freedom and my long-awaited future. I read the salary figures, the stock options, and the total buyout numbers. Every single detail was exactly as Harrison had promised. Harrison picked up the heavy silver pen and held it out to me. His expression was warm, respectful, and deeply encouraging. "You have spent the last 14 years building a brilliant foundation in the shadows, Emily," he said softly, yet loud enough for my broken husband to hear every word. "You sacrificed your own ambition to prop up a weak man who never deserved your incredible loyalty. It is time to finally step out of the kitchen and take your rightful place at the head of the boardroom. Sign the contract, Emily. You are the one we need. You are the true architect of this project, and we are ready to help you build your empire." I reached out and took the cold silver pen from his firm hand. The metal felt heavy and substantial against my fingers. I thought about the hundreds of lonely, exhausting nights I had spent hunched over my laptop at the kitchen island while Richard slept soundly upstairs. I thought about the $200,000 he had maliciously stolen from my dead parents' trust fund to buy a luxury apartment for his young mistress. I thought about the endless, suffocating insults, the cruel jokes, and the constant belittlement I had quietly endured to keep the fragile peace in my family. All of that intense pain, all of that quiet, agonizing suffering had finally led me to this exact glorious second in time. I leaned over the sleek glass coffee table. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a moment. I did not look back at the ruined man crying on the floor. I pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line on the final page of the contract. With smooth, bold, and confident strokes, I signed my name. I legally claimed my $5 million project and my brand new title as a corporate chief executive officer. I placed the pen down and handed the executed document back to Harrison Pierce. The billionaire smiled a wide, genuine smile of professional triumph and extended his hand to me. "Welcome to the executive team, Madam CEO," he announced proudly. I shook his hand firmly, feeling a magnificent surge of power and absolute liberation rush through my veins. The devoted, invisible housewife was gone forever, and a wealthy, unstoppable force had just been born. The heavy silence in our formal living room was suddenly shattered by the loud sound of Richard hitting the hardwood floor. His knees struck the polished oak planks with a dull, heavy thud. The arrogant marketing director, who had spent the entire morning treating me like an incompetent servant, was completely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified man, finally realizing his entire world had just evaporated into thin air. He looked from the $5 million acquisition contract resting in front of me to the cold, unforgiving face of his chief executive officer. Harrison Pierce did not offer him a single glance of sympathy. Richard scrambled forward, dragging himself across the expensive wool rug I had bought with my own savings. He grabbed the hem of my tailored navy trousers. His hands were shaking violently, his palms slick with cold sweat. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Emily, honey, please," he begged, his voice, a high, desperate whine that grated against my ears. "You have to tell Mr. Pierce there has been a massive misunderstanding. Tell him we built this project together. We are a team. We have been married for 14 years. You cannot just stand there and let him do this to me. I am your husband. Please, I am begging you. Give me a second chance." I looked down at the man clutching my leg. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no sorrow. I only felt a profound, icy emptiness. Just 12 hours ago, this exact same man had stood in our dining room laughing with his brother, publicly declaring me utterly useless outside of a kitchen. He had secretly drained my deceased parents' trust fund to finance a luxury life with his 24-year-old assistant. He had planned to serve me with divorce papers tomorrow and throw me out onto the street with absolutely nothing. And now he was weeping, begging me to save the very career he had tried to build using my stolen intellect. I slowly reached down and peeled his sweaty fingers off my trousers one by one. I stepped back, creating a deliberate, physical boundary between his pathetic desperation and my reclaimed power. "You do not get to invoke our marriage, Richard," I stated, my voice as calm and steady as a ticking clock. "You do not get to use the years I spent sacrificing my own ambitions to shield yourself from the consequences of your massive fraud. You made your choices when you decided I was nothing but a gullible fool you could easily discard. Harrison Pierce watched the entire exchange with the calculating patience of a seasoned corporate shark. The billionaire executive crossed his arms over his broad chest, his steely grey eyes fixed on Richard with absolute disgust. Corporate theft and intellectual fraud are severe offenses. Richard Harrison said, his deep baritone voice cutting through my husband's frantic sobbing. You attempted to sell me assets that belong entirely to your wife. You have disgraced this corporation, and you will face the absolute maximum legal and civil penalties my board of directors can unleash upon you. Richard let out a loud, agonizing moan, burying his face in his hands. But the professional execution was not finished. Intellectual property theft was only the first layer of his betrayal. The true depth of his criminality was about to be broadcast to the entire room. I reached into the deep pocket of my trousers. My fingers wrapped around the small, cold, rectangular digital voice recorder I had hidden there earlier. I pulled the device out and held it up. The tiny red indicator light blinked steadily, a silent testament to the trap he and his mistress had blindly walked into. Mr. Pierce, I said, turning my attention completely away from the weeping man on the floor. Selling stolen intellectual property is certainly a fireable offense, but I believe you will find the next piece of evidence highly relevant to your corporate accounting department. I pressed the play button on the digital recorder and turned the volume to maximum. The crisp, clear audio filled the silent living room. It was the exact conversation I had recorded in my kitchen just an hour ago. Ashley's shrill, arrogant voice echoed off the walls. She was bragging openly and enthusiastically about the luxury downtown penthouse they had supposedly purchased with cash. Then came the undeniable confession. My own recorded voice asked her how a marketing director could afford a cash down payment on a luxury condo. Ashley's recorded voice scoffed loudly, mocking my ignorance. He pulled a huge, quiet advance directly from the company expansion fund, specifically to pay for our new home, she boasted on the tape. He said the corporate auditors would not even notice the missing capital until the very end of the fiscal year, and by then, his new executive salary would cover the tracks. The digital recording continued to play, capturing every single venomous insult and every detailed admission of grand larceny. I watched the color completely drain from Ashley's face. She was still sitting on the edge of the sofa, but she looked as though she had been turned to solid stone. Her eyes were wide with pure, unfiltered terror as she listened to her own voice, happily confessing to a federal felony in front of the most powerful executive in her industry. She realized instantly that she had handed me the exact weapon needed to destroy them both. Richard stopped crying. The sound of his mistress exposing his massive corporate embezzlement shocked him into a state of absolute paralysis. He stared at the small black recorder in my hand, his mouth hanging open, entirely incapable of forming a single coherent word. He had thought he was a brilliant criminal mastermind. He had thought his financial maneuvers were completely undetectable. He never imagined his young, naive assistant would boast about his crimes to the very woman he considered a clueless housewife. I pressed the stop button. The sudden silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. I looked directly at Harrison Pierce. The chief executive officer's face had transformed from simple disappointment into a mask of terrifying quiet fury. Embezzling from an expansion fund is not a minor accounting error, I stated calmly, handing the digital recorder across the glass coffee table to Harrison. It is a severe criminal act. Harrison took the device, his large hand wrapping around it tightly. He looked down at Richard, and the sheer contempt in his eyes was enough to freeze boiling water. You used company money allocated to build new distribution centers and create jobs to buy a luxury apartment for your assistant. Harrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You did not just try to defraud your wife, Richard. You actively stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from my corporation. Richard scrambled backward, his shoes slipping against the polished wood. Mr. Pierce, please. It is a lie, he stammered wildly. I intended to put the money back. It was just a temporary bridge loan. I swear to you, I was going to replace every single dollar once I received my executive signing bonus today. His excuses were pathetic, the desperate flailing of a man caught entirely in his own web of deceit. You do not get to authorize your own bridge loans from my corporate treasury. Harrison snapped, his voice booming with absolute finality. The digital audio recording clicked to a final definitive halt. The silence that instantly flooded my formal living room was heavy, oppressive, and utterly suffocating. The air felt as though it had completely frozen in place. Harrison Pierce stood perfectly still, his large, weathered hands gripping the edges of the sleek glass coffee table. The chief executive officer was no longer just a disappointed boss, observing a failed marketing pitch. He had transformed before our eyes into a ruthless corporate predator who had just discovered a thief raiding his company vault. The thick veins in his neck were visibly pulsing against his crisp collar. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored charcoal suit and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He did not yell. He did not lose his temper or throw a theatrical tantrum. Instead, his voice was terrifyingly calm, low, and measured as he dialed his general counsel. "Get the corporate security team and our federal legal liaisons on the line immediately," Harrison ordered. His deep, gravelly voice echoed off the high ceiling, carrying the absolute weight of a multi-billion-dollar empire. "I am currently standing in Richard Pierce's living room. I have direct, irrefutable audio evidence that he has maliciously embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from our regional expansion fund. I want his corporate access completely frozen this exact second. Lock him out of the main servers, deactivate his security keycards, and freeze every single company account associated with his name. Then contact the federal authorities. We are pressing full criminal charges for grand larceny, wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. I want a team of forensic accountants tearing through every single project he has touched in the last 5 years." Richard let out a sudden, agonizing sound that was less human and more like the desperate wail of a wounded animal. He collapsed entirely against the polished hardwood floor, curling his tall frame into a pathetic, trembling ball of misery and absolute defeat. He grabbed handfuls of his own dark hair, sobbing hysterically as Harrison systematically dismantled his entire life over a 60-second phone call. The arrogant, untouchable marketing director who had mocked me so mercilessly at our anniversary dinner was gone forever. He knew he was facing a mandatory decade in a federal prison cell. He knew his professional reputation was permanently and spectacularly destroyed. He was entirely stripped of his pride, his stolen money, and his fabricated future. I turned my attention away from my weeping husband and looked over at the plush living room sofa. Ashley was sitting rigidly against the cushions. The spilled dark coffee from earlier was still staining her expensive designer dress, but she clearly no longer cared about the ruined fabric. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically between the furious billionaire executive and the weeping man on the floor. I could practically see the shallow, selfish gears turning rapidly in her panicked mind. The luxurious, effortless fantasy she had built in her head was actively burning to the ground right in front of her. The luxury downtown penthouse she had bragged about was purchased with stolen corporate funds and my embezzled family inheritance. It was absolutely going to be seized by federal investigators. The wealthy executive she thought she had brilliantly seduced was actually a massive, incompetent fraud heading straight for a prison cell. The horrifying realization hit her like a physical, crushing blow. She was directly tied to a rapidly sinking ship, and the heavy iron anchor of federal embezzlement charges was wrapping tightly around her own ankles. The terrified, trembling young girl suddenly vanished. In her place, a vicious, cornered survivor violently emerged. Ashley scrambled to her feet, her ruined designer heels clicking sharply against the wood floor. She looked down at Richard, who was reaching a trembling, sweaty hand out toward her for some shred of comfort. "Ashley, please." Richard choked out, his face streaked with hot tears and cold sweat. "Please tell Mr. Pierce it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell him I was going to put the corporate money back once the new contract was signed today. We can still fix this together." "Do not touch me!" Ashley shrieked at the top of her lungs. She violently slapped his hand away as if his skin were made of burning acid. She physically recoiled from him, her heavily made-up face twisting into a nasty mask of absolute unfiltered disgust. "You are a complete and utter fraud. You lied to me from the very beginning. You told me you were a corporate genius. You told me you were making millions of dollars on your own merit. You are nothing but a pathetic, useless middleman who stole his own wife's brilliant ideas because you are entirely too stupid to come up with your own." Richard gasped loudly, clutching his chest, as if she had just driven a physical steel blade straight through his heart. He had sacrificed his 14-year marriage, drained my parents' trust fund, and risked a massive federal prison sentence just to impress this young, shallow woman. Now, in his darkest and most terrifying moment, she was ruthlessly stripping away his very last shred of human dignity. "You ruined my entire life!" Ashley screamed, her shrill voice vibrating with toxic, selfish fury. "I am not going to federal prison for you. I am not going down with a pathetic loser who cannot even answer a simple financial math question. You are entirely useless to me now. I want absolutely nothing to do with you or your disgusting financial crimes." She grabbed her expensive leather handbag from the side table, her chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. She did not spare a single backward glance at the man sobbing on the floor. She spun around on her heel and marched directly toward the grand entryway, desperate to escape the disastrous crime scene she had so eagerly helped create. She reached for the heavy brass handle of the front door, clearly intending to drive away and leave Richard to face the federal authorities completely alone. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, placing my body squarely in her path. I blocked the heavy front door, standing tall, composed, and completely unyielding. I was no longer the quiet, invisible housewife she had mocked in my kitchen. I was the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Heritage Kitchen, and I was holding the absolute authority in my own home. "Get out of my way right now, Emily!" Ashley snapped, trying aggressively to push past my shoulder. "I am leaving this absolute nightmare. I have a car waiting right outside." I did not move a single inch. I looked at her with a cold, terrifying calmness that made her physically shrink back. "You are certainly welcome to leave my personal property, Ashley," I stated smoothly, "but you will be walking out of that door on foot. You are absolutely not taking the car." Ashley stopped, her jaw dropping open in furious, confused disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "That is my car. Richard gave me that white convertible sports car for my birthday last month. It belongs to me." I smiled, a sharp, surgical smile that held absolutely no warmth or forgiveness. "Richard is a chronic, pathological liar, Ashley. He told you he bought that luxury car for you with his massive executive bonuses. But the actual truth is he secretly drained my personal family trust fund to cover the enormous cash down payment. And because he's incredibly lazy with complex legal paperwork, he never actually transferred the final title. He quietly registered the vehicle entirely under my name to secure a much lower premium on our joint insurance policy." Her eyes widened in absolute paralyzing horror as my words finally sank into her brain. I held out my open hand, my palm facing upward, demanding her total compliance. "That expensive vehicle currently sitting in my driveway is my sole legal property," I commanded, my voice dropping to a glacial, uncompromising register. "The federal investigators will be seizing every other stolen corporate asset by tomorrow morning, but I am legally reclaiming my vehicle right now. Hand over the electronic keys immediately, or I will have the local police arrest you for grand theft auto before you even reach the end of the suburban block." Ashley stared at my open hand, completely frozen in shock. She looked back at Richard, desperately hoping for a denial, but he just continued weeping face down on the floor. She realized I had her entirely cornered with no escape route. With a loud, frustrated sob of total defeat, she unzipped her designer bag, pulled out the silver key fob, and slammed it aggressively into my open palm. She pushed past me, throwing the heavy front door wide open, and ran out into the crisp afternoon air, fleeing my property on foot with absolutely nothing left to her name. 6 months have passed since that spectacular afternoon in my suburban living room. Today, I am standing in front of a massive floor-to-ceiling window on the 40th floor of our downtown corporate headquarters. The sprawling Chicago skyline stretches out endlessly before me, bathed in the crisp golden light of an early spring morning. I press my palm against the cool, thick glass and take a long, deep breath of the filtered air. For 14 years, the only view I had of the outside world was framed by a small, narrow window above my kitchen sink. I used to stand there washing endless stacks of dishes, watching the neighborhood trees change colors with the seasons, feeling my youth slowly slip down the drain. I used to believe that small suburban plot was the absolute limit of my universe. Now I look down at the bustling city streets, the rushing yellow taxis, and the towering skyscrapers, and I realize my universe was always meant to be boundless. I turn away from the breathtaking view and walk back toward my sleek mahogany desk. I am wearing a tailored charcoal gray pantsuit cut from fine Italian wool. The fabric feels powerful and structured against my skin, a stark, exhilarating contrast to the heavy cotton aprons I wore like a uniform for over a decade. Right outside my office door, an entire corporate division is operating at maximum capacity. Telephones are ringing sharply. Marketing executives are reviewing organic supply chain logistics, and financial analysts are running the exact profit margins I formulated at my kitchen island at 3 in the morning. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Heritage Kitchen Division. I took the $5 million acquisition capital provided by Harrison Pierce, and I built this thriving enterprise from the ground up. I am no longer a silent, invisible ghost funding a treacherous husband's ambitions. I am the sole architect of my own magnificent destiny. The journey to this executive chair was paved with a grueling but profoundly satisfying legal war. The family court judge overseeing our divorce proceedings was a stern, uncompromising woman with absolutely zero tolerance for financial deception. When my attorney presented the documented trail of my stolen inheritance, the courtroom fell into a deafening silence. We displayed the original transfer receipts and the real estate deed for the luxury penthouse. Richard sat across the aisle, looking incredibly small. He tried to argue that the funds were commingled marital assets, but his blatant attempt to hide the money offshore completely destroyed his credibility. The judge ruled entirely in my favor. She granted me full, undisputed custody of our children. I retained absolute ownership of our suburban home, and the court legally forced the liquidation of the Tribeca penthouse to fully restore the $200,000 stolen from my parents' legacy. Richard walked out of that family court completely destitute, without a single penny to his very own name now. But the loss of his marital assets was merely the opening act of his spectacular downfall. Harrison Pierce delivered on his promise to unleash the full wrath of the corporate legal department. A team of ruthless forensic accountants tore through every single project Richard had managed over the past 5 years. They uncovered a massive web of fake vendor invoices and diverted expansion funds. The evidence of his corporate embezzlement was so overwhelming that the federal prosecutors did not even offer him a plea deal. I attended his sentencing hearing simply to close the darkest chapter of my life. I sat quietly in the back row of the federal courtroom, watching the man I once loved stand before the judge in a shapeless orange prison jumpsuit. His dark hair was thinning rapidly, his face was gaunt, and his arrogant posture had completely collapsed. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny and corporate fraud. As the armed bailiffs led him away in heavy steel handcuffs, Richard looked back at me over his shoulder. His eyes were red and swollen, swimming with a pathetic, desperate regret. He silently mouthed the word sorry. I did not nod. I did not smile. I simply looked right through him as if he were a complete stranger. The useless housewife he mocked was dead, and the powerful woman sitting in the gallery had absolutely no forgiveness left to give. As for his young mistress, Ashley, her grand illusion of luxury evaporated the moment the federal authorities seized the downtown penthouse. She was thrown out onto the street with nothing but a cheap suitcase and a ruined reputation. She tried to contact the media to sell a fabricated story about being a victim of a wealthy executive's manipulation, but the digital audio recording of her boasting about the stolen funds quickly silenced her. She learned the hardest possible lesson that building a life on the stolen sacrifices of another woman will eventually lead to your own absolute ruin. A soft knock on the glass door pulls me out of my dark reflections. My new executive assistant, a bright young woman named Sarah, steps into the office. She holds a blue folder filled with finalized distribution contracts for our national organic rollout. "Good morning, Madam C." "Oh," Sarah says with a bright smile. "The regional cooperative partners have signed all agreements, and the first major shipment of Heritage Kitchen products hits the shelves next week. The profit projections are already exceeding our initial quarterly estimates by 12%. I take the thick folder from her hands and open it, reviewing the crisp printed numbers. The complex financial models, the chemical stabilization formulas, the localized supply chain logistics, they are all working perfectly, just as I always knew they would. "Thank you, Sarah," I reply, my voice steady. "Please schedule a full board meeting for tomorrow morning." She nods respectfully and walks out, closing the glass door. I stand up. The city below is alive with endless possibilities and vibrant energy. As I stand here today, looking out over the city skyline that once felt so incredibly intimidating, I find myself thinking deeply about all the women who are exactly where I was just a few short months ago. I think about the devoted wives and mothers who are standing at their kitchen counters right this very minute. You might be stirring a pot of soup, folding a stack of laundry, or meticulously balancing a family checkbook, completely unaware that the solid ground beneath your feet is secretly shifting. For 14 long years, I convinced myself that my silence was the purest form of love. I genuinely believed that by shrinking myself down, by hiding my own brilliance and my financial acumen behind a perfectly tied cotton apron, I was building an unshakable foundation for my family. I thought my unwavering sacrifice would naturally be rewarded with his unwavering loyalty. That is the greatest and most dangerous lie so many of us are taught to believe from a very young age. We are constantly told that a successful marriage is an equal partnership. We are told it is a 50-50 split where one person can shine brightly in the corporate boardroom while the other quietly and dutifully manages the home front. But a true partnership only exists when there is mutual respect and total transparency. When you hand over your financial independence, when you willingly surrender your trust fund, your personal savings, and your intellectual property to a man who refuses to see your actual worth, you are not building a partnership. You are handing a loaded weapon to someone who might one day point it directly at your heart. I learned the hard way that blind trust is an expensive luxury no woman can truly afford. Richard thought he could strip me of my dignity and steal my family inheritance because I had made it so incredibly easy for him to take my presence for granted. He fundamentally mistook my domestic devotion for pure stupidity. He confused my daily choice to support his dreams with a pathetic inability to survive without him. I want to speak directly to anyone listening to my voice right now, but especially to those of you who have spent decades pouring your heart, your sweat, and your soul into a marriage, a family business, or a household. Please, hear me clearly today. Never let someone use your sacrifice as a springboard for their arrogance. The only place a woman is useless is where she shackles her own value. We confine ourselves to these tiny suffocating boxes because society dictates that quiet submission is the noble thing to do. But let me assure you, there is absolutely no nobility in allowing yourself to be entirely erased from your own life story. It is never too late to wake up from the illusion. It is never too late to open your eyes. Look closely at the joint banking statements and demand a permanent seat at your own financial table. You might be 50, 60, or even 70 years old, falsely believing that your best days are far behind you and that you must simply endure whatever disrespect is casually handed your way. That is simply not true. The wisdom, the fierce resilience, and the quiet, calculating strength you have built over a lifetime of managing daily crises and holding a complicated family together are the exact same skills you need to conquer the corporate world or simply reclaim your own personal independence. You have survived childbirth, economic downturns, and the endless exhausting demands of a household. You are a seasoned veteran of survival. Do not ever let an arrogant man convince you that your lifelong skills are useless or untransferable. When I finally took off that soiled apron and stepped boldly into the center of my formal living room that afternoon, I was terrified. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would shatter my ribs. But the exact moment I spoke my truth, the moment I presented the cold, hard evidence of my own intellectual genius to the chief executive officer, the fear vanished entirely. It was instantly replaced by a magnificent roaring fire of absolute liberation. I did not just win back my $5 million corporate project that day. I won back my soul. I remembered the fierce, unstoppable financial analyst I used to be, and I introduced her to the resilient, seasoned mother I had become. Together, we formed a force of nature that no treacherous husband could ever hope to defeat. We must completely stop protecting the reputations of people who actively plot our financial and emotional destruction. When you uncover a massive betrayal, do not shrink away in shame. Do not hide in the dark pantry crying over a man who is busy buying luxury downtown apartments for a 24-year-old assistant with your deceased parents' money. Gather your irrefutable evidence. Call a ruthless litigation attorney. freeze the joint bank accounts, and strike back with the chilling precision of a hawk. Justice is rarely handed to us graciously on a silver platter. We have to be brave enough to demand it, to fight relentlessly for it, and to stand unapologetically in our own power when the dust finally settles. If my personal journey has resonated with your heart today, I want to thank you for taking the time to let me share it. We gain our immense strength by listening to one another, by sharing our darkest moments of betrayal, and by celebrating our most glorious victories. If this story gave you strength, or if you have ever had to take your power back from someone who drastically underestimated your worth, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to support me. I want to build a strong community where we uplift and fiercely protect each other. I would love to hear from you directly in the comments section below. Leave a comment letting me know which city and time you're watching this video from. Your interaction, your personal stories, and your ongoing support are exactly what keep me going. Remember your absolute worth, protect your heart and your finances, and never apologize for shining brightly. I will see you all in the next video.